Prologue. Mike, my boy, how's life? Oh, you know me, Gramps. I can't complain. Life's good, I said while throwing up my hands. I stepped in for that warm, familiar comfort, the earnest embrace of an ebullient grandparent. It was just the thing I needed to take the edge off, like taking the first sip of hot cocoa during a snowstorm. I'm not sure which one of us appreciated it more, but either way, it was well needed with all that was going on in the world. Good to hear, my grandson. Good to hear, Mike Allen Sr. said while embracing his grandson. Who'd listen anyways? You can say that again. Wash your hands. Dinner's almost ready, he said while patting his grandson on the back. What's for dinner? Mike Allen Sr. smiled and asked in a challenging tone, What's for dinner? Why don't you tell me? Without a moment's compunction, Mike started looking around the room for some obvious clues. He glanced around for a moment to take in the room. The kitchen was a narrow galley-style kitchen like the kind you might find on a cruise ship. The walls were only about 6 feet apart and 8 feet tall. The rustic white oak cabinets ran along the wall for about 15 feet on both sides of the room. The walls and countertop adorned a classic white 6x6 subway tile. Time weighed heavily on my grandfather, much like the once pristine grout that had become smothered in grayish grime. Eyes closed, no cheating, he said while slapping his grandson's hand. Can't even cut me some slack? Come on, I'm your only grandson. Isn't that good for something? If you invested half as much time and energy in concentrating as you did complaining, you might have made one hell of a detective. Now, what do you know? Think. Mike took a snarled whiff from his narrow nostrils. Unfortunately, he didn't inherit his Napoleonic nasal passages from his Sicilian grandfather. It smells like garlic. Boom, Mike said with a little bit of bravado and a beveled laugh. Garlic? Really? We're Italian. When does it not smell like garlic? The stuff practically comes out of our pores. What else? What do you see? Try and remember. Tap, tap, tap. Mike Sr. impatiently tapped his fingers on the table like a Romanian tap dance instructor setting a tone. It was just the annoyingly repetitive sound that restricted continuous contemplation. Tap, tap, tap. The pacing of the tapping had a particularly peculiar persistency. The kind of tapping that sent shockwaves into my subconscious mind. The kind of tapping that reverberated like a radiolucent ping on a radar screen. It was as if my second-grade Catholic school teacher, Sister Agatha, was tapping on my desk with her yardstick. You left the honey out on the countertop. Good. What else? What else? What else? Mint. Mint? Was that a question or an answer? Mint. It smells like garlic, mint, and honey. Bada bing, bada boom, Mike said, and clapped his hands together in celebration. Atta boy. Now from all of that, you should be able to figure out what we've got going for dinner. Mike paused and purposely pondered his grandfather's gluttonous gauntlet. In an epiphanous moment, he replied, Lamb chops. Madone, that's my boy. Maybe you're not such a lost cause after all, he said while slapping his grandson on the back. It was the slow, philanthropic patting of a loving grandfather. The fleeting kind of pat on the back you never wanted to go away. It's funny how the simplest of gestures in life often paid the greatest dividends. Now, go make yourself useful and preheat the oven. Sure thing, Grab. 375 or what? 375? What, you're nuts? Mike, low and slow. Mike sprung up from the kitchen table and slid his wooden chair back in. The heels of the chair scraped along the tile floor as Mike pushed the chair back in. His grandfather was a stickler for the details. No matter how small or how large the detail, everything tended to matter to him. One chair out of place could mean a caper or a perp walking free on a technicality. He taught me many lessons in life, the most important of which was always sweat the small stuff. As Mike fidgeted with the settings on the oven, he looked back at his grandfather only to notice something off. He was holding something on his lap. With a careful curiosity, he asked, "What you got there, Gram?" Mike Allen Sr. was clasping onto an old photo album, like a baby clinging onto a warm bottle. That is to say, with an attuned, delicate anticipation. His hands were comically oversized for his 5'1" slender frame. From finger to finger, gaudy golden jewelry decoratively dangled on the hands of Mike Allen Sr. His attitude was about as brazen as his dress code. I figured he was game for a stroll down memory lane. He had on his nicest Italian horn and gold-plated crucifix, not to mention his finest white tank top. From my experience, everyone tended to have the same favorite subject in life, themselves. One thing I found from having so many old people in the family was that old people in particular loved talking about photo albums. I might come to regret this later on in life, but I wasn't much for keeping photographs. Too many reminders of my misgivings in life. Needless to say, I wasn't going to blow an opportunity for my grandpa to relive his heyday. "Oh, just memories. Just memories, my grandson." "Yeah? Mostly good, I take it." "That's the thing about memories. Some memories are good and some memories are bad. In the end, they're mostly just full of regret." "Yeah, that's pretty dark, Graham," Mike said while readjusting in his chair. The chairs at the dinner table were far from glamorous. Mike Sr. grew up in the wake of the Great Depression. The only time he replaced a chair was when duct tape and nails no longer held it together. "When you get to my age, in the last inning of the ball game, you'll understand. Someday, if you're lucky enough to live past 30. "Well, since you don't plan on dying anytime soon, can we crack open that photo album and relive some of those memories?" Mike Sr. gently placed the album down on the tabletop. He brushed aside some of the novelties on his dining table to make space for the large leather-bound album. He kept a wide array of tchotchkes scattered across the kitchen table. There was an old bobblehead doll, a deck of casino playing cards, and a wide assortment of chewing gum. "Oh, you're in for an education." Mike Sr. unfolded the album and began to outline the better part of his adulthood with his grandson. "See, back in my day, we didn't have any fancy digital cameras. Heck, we had to buy the cameras, film, and even pay to print the darn photos." "Oh, you don't say. Wow." "Don't be such a strunzo. I'm trying to teach you something. Pay attention," he said while slapping the top of Mike's greasy hands. In all fairness to my grandpa, I should have known better. Heck, I was raised better than that. There was a lot on my mind, and it was starting to show. "Wipe your hands off if you want to touch the photos. What's the matter with you?" he said with his open palm raised in the air. "Sorry," Mike said while grabbing a napkin. Mike gingerly massaged his hands with one of the old faded napkins sitting on the dinner table. The napkins had the coarseness and color of cardboard. "See? We had to pay for everything back in my day. So we didn't waste money on taking photos of our food. We didn't have a delete button or social media. Back in my day, you could get all the settings right, lighting, everything, and still muck it up by exposing the film to sunlight." "Well, that sounds like a real drag." Mike Sr. shook his head at his grandson's silliness. "Where's that at?" Mike asked while pointing to one of the many photos on the page. "Ah, that. That, my grandson, is the RMS Queen Mary." "You say that like somehow I should know what that is." Can't expect you millennials to know everything. Well, back in my day, the RMS Queen Mary was the cruise liner of the rich and famous, the creme de la creme. The ship dripped of delusion and grandeur," he said while puttering off, like an old station wagon running on fumes hoping to make it to the nearest gas station. He stared deep into the photo, as if he'd fallen under some kind of hypnotic gaze. "I guess it's true what they say. When you get old, don't let your heart die. The Japanese call it takasubo. I call it broken heart syndrome." "Looks nice." "Nice? You kids don't know the first thing about luxury. You wouldn't know luxury if it ran up and slapped you in the face. That ship still is one of the most luxurious experiences this side of the Mississippi. You don't stay. Maybe I'll give it a shot sometime. Why not? The damn thing is sitting down there moored up in Long Beach Harbor. Really? I spent a week out to sea to celebrate my retirement from the force. It was wonderful. My grandfather was a man of simple tastes, but once in a while sprung for extravagancy. It'd be hard to tell based on the Frankenstein of a chair I found myself sitting on. I kind of gleaned that from the photos, Gramp. Don't be such a wise guy. Who's that? I said, while pointing to one of the photographs. Her? Oh, just someone I met on the boat. Olivia, I think. Something or other like that. Do you miss it? The Queen? No. Being a detective, you schmuck. Do you miss your old job? Part of me does. Part of me doesn't. It was the best part of my life, and it was the worst part of my life. Don't get married to your work, kid. Enjoy your life. Don't get so caught up in what you do, that what you do becomes who you are. But now the days are short. I'm in the autumn of my years, and I think of my life as a vintage wine. From fine old kegs, Mike Allen Sr. said while trailing off and perusing through the photo album. He delicately fondled the edges of the page as he feebly flipped the pages. With his head down, he asked his grandson, Speaking of which, how's the whole insurance thing going? Mike nodded at the sage advice of his grandfather and deflected his question with a question. What did you mean? What do I mean? What did you mean, what did I mean? Kid, I can read the Times, Mike Allen Sr. said with a scolding tone of voice, the kind of customary sarcastic-laced question that everyone knew the answer to before it was asked. His words were as steamy as a freshly baked clam chowder being served on the first day of winter in New England. Part of me knew better than to answer a question with a question. Part of me knew I could never be lucky enough to slip something past my Gramps. Part of me wanted to bury the lead and change the subject. Oh, I'm taking a break from the whole insurance thing, at least for a while. It's complicated. Complicated? You know, if I didn't know any better, I think you might need an escape plan right now. Why don't you go? Go? I just got here. Stop being such a putz. Why not give it a shot? Heck, make a grand old time of it. Meet some people. Make some friends. Go and make your own photo album. There's one guarantee in life. You got one life to live, so go live it. Mike sat there carefully contemplating his grandfather's persuasive proposal. He started nodding his head like one of those bobblehead dolls you get at Dodger Stadium on Thursday night. Aside for a love from baseball, Mike inherited his incessant need to stay occupied from his grandfather. Ironically enough, he was named after him, and just so happened to inherit his acrimonious anxiousness, the kind of lingering anxiety that draped over his mood like a scuba diver entangled in a squalid stench of seaweed. I might just do that. Chapter 1. A Reception Meant for a Queen. Welcome to the Queen Mary. How can we help you on this spooky evening? The hostess asked in an emphatical elegance. Good evening. I've got a reservation under Allen. Mike Allen, Mike said while reaching into his pants for his wallet. Mike had a weathered wallet made of a cheap broken brown leather. It was loosely held together by duct tape and a bit of hope. He fished the wallet out of his pants and slammed it on the desk. Splendid. We're happy to have you aboard, Mr. Allen, the guest services concierge said while swiftly typing away at her keyboard. Click, 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 click. The keystrokes were deliberate and annoyingly loud, like an ice maker dropping a bunch of ice cubes into a stainless steel ice tray. It must have been one of those old-school mechanical keyboards, the kind you might find buried away in a garage sale or tucked away somewhere in your attic. Normally, I wouldn't pay so much mind to something so innocuous, but the commute had aggressively amplified my agitation. The concierge had a gold-plated name badge tacked onto her left lapel. Mike caught himself staring at it in an attempt to read her name. Her accent was faintly finessed with a foreign familiarity. Her demeanor was oddly lugubrious, considering she was the face of the company. "What a drive," Mike said to drum up some customary small talk. In all reality, the conga line of customers wasn't much different from traversing the jungle that is the 405 freeway. It was the best California had to offer. It was the worst California had to offer. It was the 405 freeway. The check-in line moved a lot like the traffic, that is to say, at a snail's pace. "Where are you coming from, Mr. Allen?" "Mr. Allen is my father and grandfather. You can call me Mike, sweetie." She winced a smile and replied, "Where are you coming from, Mike?" "Thousand Oaks." Mike often dropped his hometown without pretext, because it often followed a slew of unsolicited compliments. Thousand Oaks was once a rural town. Now it's more like a watered-down version of Beverly Hills. "Oh, Thousand Oaks. I hear it's lovely up there this time of year." "Oaktown? It's not too bad," he said while outstretching his arms like a scarecrow. Mike began to yawn and reflexively covered his gaping mouth with his palm. "Tired already?" "Yeah, the 405 can sap the mojo out of just about anybody. Driving it can be somewhat unforgiving this time of night. You're almost better off waiting until the evening and avoid the rush hour traffic." Mike nodded in agreement and began to nonchalantly scan the lobby of the hotel. The hostess noticed his detached gaze and began to continue her friendly banter, like a fisherman throwing chum in the waters. "So how long's your stay with us?" "Just for the night, Katharina," Mike responded in a somewhat curt fashion as he read her name badge. He fancied himself a good judge of accents, but he was starting to get perturbed that he couldn't pinpoint the origins of her dialect. Mike's eyes anchored for 1 second too long on the lapel of the concierge. When he looked up, he noticed her cheeks started blooming a brilliant bashful red hue. Traversing the 405 freeway during rush hour traffic paid a heavy toll on Mike Allen's normally sunny disposition. He was about as deflated as a DMV employee counting down the last seconds of a Friday afternoon. "Well, I dare say you joined us on the most popular night of the year," she said while speedily running her fingers across the keyboard. Click, 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 click. The hostess looked up from her computer monitor and asked, "Are you celebrating any kind of special occasion?" The hostess was a slender young woman with skin as pale as a ghost. She clearly hadn't spent much time above deck. Her pleasing demeanor was as soothing to Mike as a tub of aloe vera being dumped on a fresh sunburn. She sported a typical hotel pantsuit-style uniform. Her blonde dreadlocks careened with even the slightest movement of her head. To say the least, Mike was rather entranced in her mystique. My grandmother once told me that I used to go around saying I would be a lifelong bachelor. What could I say? I might as well have had a tattoo on my arm that said, "Lady Killer." "Special? You mean aside from Halloween?" She smiled and responded politely. "Well, yes, aside from Halloween. What brings you to the Mary?" The concierge raised her hands from the keyboard and made a spooky wavy fingers gesture. She probably felt it helped lighten the mood and add to the ambiance. I couldn't help but smile. "My grandfather stayed here on the last voyage, back in '67. "Did he? Oh, how cool. It's hard to believe the last voyage was so long ago," she replied. "Yeah, I thought I'd give it a shot and see what all the buzz was about for myself. No time like the present, I always say." "You could say that again," she said while tactfully typing. Click, 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 click. "How's your day so far?" "Oh, I can't complain. Who'd listen anyways, right?" Click, click, click. "Everything okay?" What could I say? I'm a problem solver by nature. I hear someone's having a tough day and immediately feel the inclination to investigate like a drug-sniffing dog catching the scent of a fresh stash of Mary Jane tucked into the seat of an early 2000s Honda Civic. Long day, that's all. Like I said, I can't complain, she said somewhat defensively. The hostess has locked her gaze onto the computer monitor, like the hypnotic trance of a teenager discovering social media for the first time. Her pale white face basked in the brilliant bloom of blue light from the bulky computer monitor. She broke her trance and pulled out the map of the hotel from under her desk. She slid the map in front of Mike and started jotting down points of interest with a big red pen. She started slashing up the map with circles and arrows. Mike was impressed by her ability to write upside down. It was an acquired skill he was never quite able to get a solid grasp on. On board, we have 2 5-star restaurants. Well, first, let me ask, what did you have planned for tonight? Plans? Haven't thought that far ahead. You wouldn't happen to have any suggestions? Oh, I do. Tonight is the night for the world-famous Haunted Ghost Tour. Mike scoffed at her exuberance. He was amused by the very idea of a haunted tour. He wasn't a religious man, but open to the possibility of superstition and mysticism. Haunted tour? Mike said skeptically at the rather suspect suggestion. Trust me, it's to die for. People come from all over the world to be part of the tour, she said while tapping on the hotel map with the ballpoint pen. Mike took a second to soak in the surroundings and get a better appreciation for the ambiance of the boat. The boat was old yet lusciously luxurious. The boat was cramped yet delicately decadent. The boat was retro yet capaciously charming. To die for? No, seriously. Since 1936, the Queen Mary has had 16 reported fatalities, and who knows how many unreported. 16 fatalities? You're kidding me, right? I wish I was. Everything from skull fractures to accidental poisonings to natural causes, the last of which... She took a momentary pause in her exposition to click around on the keyboard. Mike looked on curiously at the hostess with an eagerness for her finish to her story. His eyebrows were raised up like 2 rambunctious rainbows covering his scalp. The hostess took Mike's repository respite in the conversation as a sign to continue. Sorry about that. Where was I? Something about the last of, Mike said as if hanging on her every word. He was about as transparent as a jellyfish. Ah, yes, the last of the deaths. The last of the fatalities occurred on the very night your grandfather stayed aboard the Queen Mary. That's unreal, Mike replied, somewhat shocked by her proclamation. He might have been more shocked by his grandfather leaving out that crucial detail from the story. Mike chalked it up to a coincidence or old age. It wouldn't be the Queen Mary if it seemed real. These are stories, she said while trailing off and losing her focus. Mike looked at Katharina with a curious and inviting gaze. It was fairly obvious she knew how to captivate an audience. You know what? Instead of telling you, can I make you a reservation? A reservation? For the Haunted Ghost Tour. Can I book you on the midnight tour? Ah, yes, the Haunted Tour, Mike said while pondering her obstreperous offer. He had nothing better to do and was always game for a new adventure, anything to forget about his recent foyer into the insurance startup culture. Click, 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 click. Sure thing. Why not? Sign me up. What the hell, right? You only get one shot in this crazy world. The hostess smiled and said, Excellent choice. The Haunted Tour on Halloween. What better way to celebrate such a special occasion? Click, 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 click. Mike leaned up against the countertop and pedantically peered over her desk. He wanted to get a better look at the reception area. Mike often dwelled on the small details. For Mike, he learned that a reception area was a lot like a book, in that you shouldn't judge a book by the cover. The countertop was made of solid red oak and polished to a sleek shine. Cha-chug, Ch-chug, ch-chug. The panicky printer broke Mike's trance. The concierge swung around and snatched the ticket out of the printer tray. "Here you go, hot off the presses," she said while hastily handing over the torrid ticket. Mike smiled at the hostess and gently gazed into her eyes. She smiled back to match his big dumb grin. "So you're currently at the reception desk here," she said while drawing a large red circle on the map. "The haunted tour starts down here. Make sure to be 15 minutes early just in case. The tour lasts about an hour, but could be longer in the off chance something doesn't go according to plan," she said and paused for dramatic effect. I'd be stupid not to ask. What do you mean according to plan? Well, it's a haunted tour for a reason. Guests regularly report ghosts, aberrations, ghouls, and goblins. Didn't your mother ever teach you that life doesn't always go according to plan? She asked while stroking one of her dreadlocks in a pacifying motion. I could tell she was needlessly nervous. People often underestimate the power of the subconscious mind. Whether she was aware of it or not, her nervous system was flashing sirens of distress, like an out-of-control car swerving all over the road. You don't really believe in all that, do you? Ghosts and ghouls? Mike asked in earnest. Mike believed in odds above all else, and to him, the odds of something being unexplainable by science were rather low. "Oh, I most certainly do. The Mary stole the souls of 16 seaworthy sailors. Some say far more." "So," he said to break the awkward silence, part of me wanting to divert the conversation. Who thinks like that? Who really believes in ghosts? She must have been pulling my leg. "So, we have you in a portside room, room 1337, one of the best suites available. The view is to die for," she said without skipping a beat. Click, 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 click. The hostess interlocked her fingers and outstretched her hands. Her forearms were worn down from all the typing, like an author typing his 10th draft of a novel. "Just go up the stairs behind you, out to the left, and take the first elevator to the top deck." She started outlining the map with various directions. "How many keys would you like for your room? Are you planning for any guests or—" "Just one key is fine." Click, 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 swipe, swipe. The hostess swiped the card across the card reader with a pleasantly aggressive motion, like a lumberjack sawing a tree trunk with one of those old hand saws. "Here you go," she said while slowly sliding the card across the reception desk to Mike Allen. He grabbed for the card, and the two accidentally bumped fingers in the process. They both looked up at each other with an awkward smile. "Do you have dinner plans? Did you have reservations at one of our restaurants?" she said while stroking the tips of her dreadlocks. "Dinner plans? No plans, no reservations. I'm open to suggestions." In reality, I was fishing for a date. I believe in odds, and dating was merely an odds game. The more attempts I made, the better luck I seemed to create for myself. "Sir Winston's is our world-famous restaurant. I hear it's to die for. A must for anyone taking the haunted tour." "Sir Winston. Is there anything else I can do for you?" the hostess asked as she twirled the torrid tip of her dreadlock. Her dreadlocks were pale and white, like an interlocked twine of soaked silk. "Just one thing, Kat." "What's that?" "What are you doing for dinner?" "Oh, I had a long day. I'll probably grab something on the way home, maybe a burger or something. I haven't thought that far ahead, to be honest." "Why don't you join me?" She didn't respond immediately to his request. She raised her left hand up to her cheek to casually cover her faintly blushed face. She looked away to ponder the outrageously oafish offer. Mike tilted his head to the side and glanced at her with an inviting gaze. I'll make it easy for you. What time do you get off?" An hour. I get off in an hour." "Great. I'll snag us a table. If you're hungry, Come join me in an hour or so. If not, more wine for me. Chapter 2. Dinner for Two. Sir Winston's was just a hop, skip, and a jump from the reception area. The outside of the restaurant was rather imposing. Mike was merely a lowly insurance professional. The floor was adorned with a robust red carpet with a purple inlay, the kind of carpet lathered in a richness that might be found in an upscale penthouse apartment. The doorway of the restaurant was framed with gold plating. Mike stepped through the doorway with a sheepish subtlety, slowly peering his head in like a ballerina leering behind a stage curtain before a big show. "Welcome to the world-famous Sir Winston's Steakhouse," the balding maitre d' bellowed blissfully. He sung the words out like a carnival barker attempting to draw in a crowd. Mike looked up at the maitre d' with a big smile, like a dog staring up at his owner. The maitre d' stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. His head practically touched the ceiling beams. He was wearing an all-pearl white uniform with white shoes and white gloves to match. I felt more like a child standing outside of a roller coaster while the attendee checked my height. Luckily for me, this ride didn't have a height requirement. "How can I help you this evening?" Mike cleared his throat and said, "Table for two, please." "Table for two. Do you have a reservation?" the maitre d' said while doing a terse scan over the reservation list. "I do. At least, I think I do. I'm part of the haunted ghost tour this evening." "Ah, I'll seat you next to the other tour guests," he said while readjusting his lapel. Ding ding, ding ding, ding ding. The maitre d' flagrantly flanged and captivatingly clanged the dinner bell. The dimly lit restaurant shined and shimmered with the golden refraction of incandescent light bulbs bouncing off the gold-plated captain's bell. The bell had a 6-inch black leather handle and couldn't have been more than 3 inches in diameter. For such a petite bell, it sure packed a big wallop. "Follow me, sir," he said and led the way through the restaurant. We didn't make it 10 feet before the maitre d' stopped abruptly, looked back, and asked, "Sir, will your guest be arriving soon?" "To be honest, I'm not sure." "Well, follow me. We'll get you a table." Mike sat down at one of the smaller dining tables and began to stare aimlessly out into the harbor. He couldn't help but wonder whether or not his grandfather had eaten at this very table 60-some-odd years before. Mike grabbed the oversized dinner menu and stood it upright on the table. The menu was as expansive as a fully loaded plate of nachos. The menu was about 18 inches tall and covered the better part of Mike's periphery view. "Sir, I'll be your waiter tonight. My name is Tony. If you need anything, I'm your guy." Mike lowered his dinner menu and said, "Sounds good to me." "What could I start you off with tonight?" Tony looked at the empty seat with a curious disposition. It was one of those awkward, disappointed grins people adorned when they saw half their tip disappear in front of their eyes. At one point in my life, I was dependent on the generosity of others to make a living. Either way, I'd make sure to leave a decent tip. "Are you waiting for one more, or—" "Tony, give me about 5 minutes and I can probably better answer that question." "I got you. How about a drink while you wait?" "Sure, why not? A bottle of your most overpriced Pinot Noir. That'll do me just fine." "Coming right up, sir," Tony said, and scurried off to the wine rack to pull an overpriced bottle of wine. It was the kind of wine that you could upsell to foreigners and tourists looking to spend some paper. Mike placed the menu back up and continued to peruse the various entrees for the main course. In reality, it was an affront to conceal his utter failure at spitting game with the concierge. Don't get me wrong, I love a good bottle of wine and wrestling with my inner demons, but tonight I was hoping for some friendlier companionship. Oh well, more wine for me, I guess. Apparently I must be losing my sex appeal. "Is this seat taken?" a soft voice murmured. Mike placed the dinner menu back down on the table. To his delight, was the luscious and lanky Katharina Myers standing sheepishly ajar from the table. Mike beamed a smile as a show of a warm reception. He pointed over to the seat with his hand, and she slid into it like a race car driver sliding into a pit stop. She started looking around awkwardly, hoping to avoid any judgment from her coworkers. "What's good here?" Katharina was jolted by the question, like a recently resuscitated patient shocked back to life by a defibrillator. "I honestly have no idea," she said, and trailed off. Mike raised his eyebrow and tilted his head to the right. It was the politest way he knew to say WTF without actually saying WTF. Kat immediately picked up on the signal and continued by saying, "Oh, I've never eaten here before." "Well, looks like we're in the same boat." "Yeah, you could say that again," she said without picking up on the sarcasm. She started uncomfortably fidgeting in her chair. Mike considered himself somewhat of an expert when it came to reading people, but for some reason couldn't get a solid read on his new companion. "Look, I don't really know about this. I'm really not supposed to date the guests," she said with a whisper and half-covered mouth. "Date? Who said this was a date? Don't get ahead of yourself. We're just two people eating dinner," Mike said jokingly to deflect the understandable awkward tension in the room. The tension was as awkward as it was cliché, in that you could cut it with a knife. The hostess started blushing and smiled back at Mike. She started subtly nodding up and down. At first, I wasn't sure what to make of it all. Was she into it? Did she want to eat and make out like a bandit? Time was the great artificer of life, in that I would soon find out. "Okay, good," she said with a seductively sassy and satisfied grin. Katharina started vigorously investigating the menu. She ran her fingers and eyes up and down the menu. Just as fate would have it, Tony the waiter walked back over to the table, dropping off a fresh decanter of Pinot Noir. He flipped over the wine glasses and started pouring a glass for Mike Allen. "What are you drinking this evening, miss?" I'll have a martini, please. Stirred, not shaken." "Right away, miss," the waiter said while scurrying away to the bartender. "Do I detect a little bit of an accent?" Mike said while making intuitive hand gestures. It was one of the many side effects of being raised in an Italian family. Katharina delicately placed the menu down on the table and started stroking the ends of the leather-bound menu with her fingertips. The menu was wrapped in a thick black leather and embroidered with a golden thread. "Are you from the area?" Mike said while slowly sloshing his wine glass. The wine swirled around the sides of the glass, like waves crashing against the hull of a ship at high tide. Katharina winced a smile and said, "Nope, and don't bother guessing." Mike put his hands together and rubbed them for a moment. He was intrigued by the challenge and fancied himself an expert at deductive reasoning. He raised his eyebrows up in excitement while putting the pieces of the puzzle together. "You'll never guess it," she repeated. "Only one way to find out. Give me a hint." She shook her head despondently. Although she protested initially, Mike knew she was equally game for watching him blunderbuss his way through a seemingly impossible exercise. The waiter slid on by the table and dropped off the martini glass for the lady. "I could give you 10 hints and you still wouldn't get it." "I just need one," Mike replied with a jovial and pompous tone of voice. "Just one? Okay, I'm game. My parents are from nearly opposite sides of the earth." "That's my clue?" "A second ago you were Sherlock Holmes. What else do you need?" Okay. Don't make it too easy for me. I didn't catch your last name." "Myers. Katharina Myers." "Oh. Well, that makes it rather easy, Ms. Myers." She scoffed and said, "You'll never guess. I'm telling you, don't bother. Many have tried and many have failed." Mike placed his hands up, creating a frame around her face like an old-timey photographer setting up a still photo. "Myers narrows down half the equation for me." Katharina was skeptical of his claim and squinted her eyes in disbelief of his dubious conclusion. She started stroking the menu with her index fingers. The leather had a coarseness created over years of being exposed to salty sea air. "Does it?" she said, while rubbing the brim of her martini glass with her index finger. Myers. Myers is a name commonly found in the Caribbean. If I'm not mistaken, it's most commonly found in Jamaica. Quite commonly found there, in fact. Which is why I take it you are so soft-spoken. Your father? Yes, your father is most likely from Jamaica. She started slowly nodding her head and took a lackadaisical soothing sip from her martini glass. Now, the question is, where is your mother from? Mike gallantly gazed at his geographically grand dinner guest. Can you pronounce a word for me? A word? Which word did you have in mind? Can you say proverb? She was perplexed by the question, but plowed on by providing a provincial pronunciation of the word in question. Proverb? Well, well, well. That certainly narrows it down for me. Does it really? She asked without compunction or predilection. Your mother is from a German-speaking country. Normally I'd peg her for Germany, but that'd be too easy. There are approximately 42 countries that speak some kind of German. Your kind of German, however, comes from a place called Switzerland. Your mother is Swiss. Katharina took the olive out of her martini glass and sucked it down. She slowly removed the toothpick from her mouth and placed it on the table. A faint impression of her red lipstick imprinted on the toothpick. Okay. Okay? Okay, I'm impressed. Probably not as impressive as the story of how they met. How they met? It's a long story. Last time I checked, we've got all night. Do we? She asked somewhat salaciously. Mike took a conspicuous sip of wine to stall for time. The pinnacle of any good date was an awkward, palpable pause. Pausing was an art form. Pause too short, and it loses any effect. Pause too long, and it gets creepy. What you have to find is that porridge is just right kind of customary awkward pause. The kind of pause that is just right. Believe it or not, they met on the final voyage of this very cruise liner. Really? You don't say. I do. My mother was a passenger, and my father was a deckhand. It was one of those classic star-crossed lovers met at first sight kind of love stories. Should we figure out what we want to eat? Oh yeah, food. I almost forgot. I'm starving. The couple went back to perusing the purposefully oversized dinner menus. The menu was broken down into 3 sections of 3-course meals. It was a large menu with a small selection. The irony wasn't lost on the couple. The couple cudgeled the menu with some obligatory small talk. What do you feel like? I'll take dinner. How about you? Katharina giggled gleefully at Mike's gregarious sarcasm. It was one of those uncomfortable obligatory giggles, like a wife laughing at a husband's bad joke. You know what I mean. Just as Mike was about to respond, the winsome waiter waltzed back and interjected himself into the conversation. Okay, what are we having, folks? I'll take the 16-ounce T-bone steak. All right, 1 T-bone for the lady. How would you like it cooked? Give it to me how I eat sushi. Raw. Mike's eyebrows shot up faster than Marilyn Monroe's dress while standing over a subway grate in New York City. 1 T-bone steak, wave it over the flame, pink and bloody. Would you like soup or salad as your side? I don't eat rabbit food. I'll take soup, please, she said while placing her menu back onto the table. Mike gawked at the guest's dinner order. I guess I'll have what she's having, Mike said while handing the waiter over his menu. The couple conjoined in the cozy comfort of cheeky conversation. The waiter would occasionally chime in with the couple. Here and there he popped in to make his presence known and the guests feel a sense of comfortability. Mike took a large bite of his appetizer and asked, So, how does someone come to work on a haunted cruise liner turned destination hotel? Katharina took an equally obnoxious bite of her appetizer and explained, I ask myself the same question of almost every day. She sat there pondering the answer while gulping down some wine. The redness of the wine projected a protuberant purplish shadow around the bottom of the glass as she placed it back on the dinner table. The glass made a large clink. You see, I love to travel. It's always been a dream of mine to travel the world, see new things, meet new people. I could see that, he said, while restraining the better half of his sarcasm. Mike found it ironic that someone who wanted to travel the world worked on a permanently marooned cruise liner. He took the decanter of wine and refreshed her glass. Mike always found wine to be the most suitable concomitant for getting better acquainted with strangers. Is that something your family was always into, or kind of your own thing? Like I was saying earlier, my father met my mother on this very ship. So happens they met on the last trip across the Atlantic. My father worked on the ship, and my mother was traveling from Switzerland to America. Yeah, you know, that oh-so-typical love story. She looked back at Mike with an almost amatory gaze. He abruptly started fidgeting with the silverware on the table and randomly began rearranging everything to his liking. The waiter snuck in and slipped piping hot T-bone steaks onto the dinner table. Careful, these plates are hot. By the looks of it, so is the conversation. Anything else I could grab you? Another bottle of wine? Any wine in particular? The waiter said, somewhat sarcastically. I was under the distinct impression he wasn't used to serving people with such lack of sophistication. To me, wine was just that. It was wine. I didn't take much care in knowing brands, vintages, or the complexities of regional flavor profiles. The only problem I had with steakhouses was the unwritten expectation that if I ordered a bottle of wine, I should be a sommelier. I looked back at the waiter with a less than sober response and replied, "Red." Kat gleefully looked at her T-bone steak and said, "Ketchup, please." Ketchup? Is she for real? Surely she must be joking. Who in the right mind would ruin a $100 T-bone steak by smothering it with tomato paste and vinegar? How sacrilege, I thought. The waiter was equally as offended by the request. He stood motionless, like a deer staring down headlights on the highway. "Right away," he said while walking away. I could tell he was somewhat glib serving us. He held this aura of snootiness only found in upscale restaurants. As a former server myself, albeit at a less fancy restaurant, I always found it auspicious to treat each guest like gold. Ketchup on a T-bone steak? Kat scoffed and asked affirmatively, "Have you ever tried it?" Well, no, I can't say that I have. I suppose to some extent my protest was more based on the relative taboo of the situation rather than personal experience. "Don't knock it till you try it," she said while flashing her eyebrows twice. I thought it a ripe time to drain the decanter and wait for our respective bottles. Mike picked up the decanter and started topping off Kat's glass. The long pour flowed like a waterfall into her wine glass. He poured every last ounce of wine into the glass. It left a faint rose-colored hue in the decanter, like the rosy stain imprinted on a used blood bag. "So, what do you do for a living?" Mike responded while putting down his glass of wine. Unbeknownst to Mike, the wine had left a purplish red stain on his perfectly pristine porcelain teeth. "I'm assuming you don't make your living traveling from hotel to hotel offering strange women 5-star dining experiences." "No, of course not. I haven't done that in hours," Mike said while carving into his steak. Nothing produced quite the unique sound like a solid silver steak knife scratching against the plate. The congealed fat clung into the edges of the steak like a loose-fitting silk kimono around a newlywed on her honeymoon. What do I do for a living? That's a good question. You've known me for a couple hours now. What do you think? You don't like ketchup on your steak, so I figured you're probably a serial killer or a salesman. Serial killer? Why would you say that? You have 2 first names and terrible pickup lines. That's why. Terrible enough to get you to dinner. Fair enough. I might be old-fashioned, but it probably isn't a great idea to ask someone if they're a serial killer on a first date. I haven't decided. Decided? If this is a first date. Okay, so you're not a serial killer. What do you do? I'm an insurance actuary. An insurance actuary? It's kind of complicated. Uh-huh. So you sell insurance, or... Sell insurance? No, not anymore. It's complicated. So? Mike pulled out his napkin and started unfolding it. It was a lazy way to stall for time as he dug up an apt analogy. Although he loved being in the insurance industry, he often found it quite difficult to explain to the uninitiated. Yeah, how do I explain this? Do you like to gamble? Of course. Who doesn't like to gamble? Well, in essence, I help people gamble. Well, not people per se. I help insurance companies gamble. Gamble? On what? How do I do this without completely derailing the conversation? I sat there for a second to contemplate the best explanation with the least amount of risk to killing the mood. In this case, the simplest explanation would probably suffice. It's kind of complicated, but I'll try to make it simple. Try me. Mike shook his head and put down his utensils on the table. He started looking around the room while dabbing his mouth with the corner of his napkin. Somehow, he felt, that would make his observations less conspicuous to the other guests. How do I explain this? How do I... You see that couple over there? Mike asked while nudging over to the bar with his head. Kat looked over to the bar and spotted an older gentleman sitting alongside a much younger female companion. She was wearing a thin red dress and black 6-inch stilettos. You mean geriatric Casanova sitting over there at the bar? Salt and pepper hair. He's about what, 5 feet 9 inches, give or take? Looks about right to me. Based on the untucked button-up shirt and nylon waist-banded designer jeans, I'd say he's hiding a bit of a gut. He probably weighs about 220 pounds. Easy. You can tell all that from over here? Educated guess, Kat. I'm assuming this is going somewhere. Mike twirled his wine glass and said, if you were to guess, how long do you think the average male life expectancy is in the United States? Kat scoffed at the question and said, I have no clue. Mike picked up the water pitcher on the table and gestured to refill Kat's empty glass. She smiled and graciously held out her glass. Over or under 80, he asked to the backdrop of pouring water, ice cubes plunging into her glass making several audible thuds and clangs. She smiled and Mike took that as a sign to stop pouring. You see people all day, every day. You see young people, you see old people. What do you think? I'd say over? I mean, people live pretty long nowadays. Seems like it's over 80. 76 years old. And I'd say by the looks of it, Casanova over there is at least 2 marriages deep. Based on his midlife crisis wardrobe, flashy jewelry, I'd say he's pushing at least 59 to 65. Kat locked her gaze onto the gentleman at the bar to analyze Mike's deductive dossier. Here's the crazy part. I can probably tell you when and how he's going to die. Based on his BMI, estimated age, and lifestyle, I'd say that there is a 92.5% chance of a heart attack-related fatality within the next 7 years. You can tell all that? From a glance? She asked while covering her bottom lip with the tips of her fingers. The faint yellow glow of the chandeliers and candlelight refracted against her sparkly nail polish like the twinkles of a star fading against the backdrop of the rising sun. Well, yeah, that and the fact he was behind me in line. I had plenty of time listening to him spit game at the young, unsuspecting damsel in distress. Kat whipped her napkin at Mike in a show of condemnation for his shrewd showmanship. My job is to look down into a magic hat and pull out a rabbit. You sure know how to leave an impression on a girl. Mike clutched onto the top of his wine glass with his fingertips. He started slowly turning the glass like a thief twisting the dial on a safe. Someone told me that Marilyn Monroe once said, "Life is too short to be boring." Now, I don't really know if she ever said that, but I'd be damned if she was wrong. Kat scoffed and asked in a salacious tone, "Any other tricks you plan on pulling out of your magic hat that I should know about, Mr. Allen?" "Depends." I never understood the customary mundane conversations that often accompanied a first date. What's the point of putting a mask up? It's not like I'm looking to get married after the first date. The way I saw it, I might as well push my chips in and see where it goes. "Depends, huh? On what?" Kat grasped onto her butter knife with both hands and began to fidget with it. She started tapping her fingers on the knife. Mike chalked it up to some kind of nervous tic that was born from checking in thousands of guests on that old mechanical keyboard. "Depends on if we make it past dessert or not." "Speaking of which, anything standing out to you in the dessert menu, or what?" Mike pulled up the supplementary dinner menu and began to peruse the dessert options. He managed to hide the better part of his face with the menu, tilting it partially on the table and lazily running his index finger up and down the menu. He was perusing the menu like a writer with writer's block, rapidly running through a thesaurus. Chapter 3. The Haunted Tour. During her more seaworthy days, the RMS Queen Mary crossed the Atlantic 1,000 times over the span of 40 years, the tour guide explained to his captive audience. The crowd followed his banter with a gaggle of habitual oohs and ahs. Eventually, Mike's curiosity ended up getting the better of him, and he slowly migrated his way to the head of the group. Katharina was following close behind her unwitting chaperone, like a newly hatched gosling trotting behind the mother goose. "My name is Hans. Tonight, I'll be the ferryman guiding you down the river Styx. The rules are simple. Keep your eyes and ears open at all times. Keep your hands inside the ride at all times. We'll be exploring the inner bowels of the vessel, and it can be rather easy to get lost. If you stop, I'll try my best to let you catch up. If you get lost, don't worry. I'll add your name to the future ghost stories." Hans paused and waited for the customary chuckles to subside, the kind of laughter you'd hear at a corporate retreat when one of the bosses attempts to tell an off-the-cuff joke. "If you get lost, just follow the red exit signs and make your way back topside. Any questions? No? Great." Hans advanced down a narrow corridor, and the group followed in kind. From the exterior, the vessel seemed so imposing, but the hallways weren't much wider than a normal run-of-the-mill hotel. Mike began to extend his arms as he walked to guesstimate the width of the hallway. His 6-foot wingspan left his fingertips about 8 inches free in either direction. "From top to bottom, the Queen is 180 feet of iron and steel," Hans said while parading the passengers out of the corridor and onto the ship's gloomy deck. At night, the moon beamed bright white fluorescent refractions off the water of Long Beach Harbor. It created this luminescent, reflective glow on the weathered white paint of the hull. The pale white paint cracked across the hull like varicose veins across an old pair of legs. "If any of you are wondering how the ship got her illustrious name, follow me to find out." The words of the tour guide were soaked in the faint wailing of the wind, each passing breath wafted in the warm sea breeze. "The Queen was named after Mary of Teck, the wife of King George V. Unfortunately, King George died under mysterious circumstances just days before the completion of the vessel. Some conspiracy theorists go so far as to say foul play might have been involved in his tragic demise. Either way, how rather auspicious, don't you think? How do you figure that? It's a haunted ship, right? To have the very person who commissioned the vessel die under mysterious circumstances is quite the lucky coincidence. I'd say that must have boosted ticket sales quite a bit for the first voyage. Katharina found herself bracing a rosy blemish of a blush after her companion's blunderer's lack of self-awareness. She wasn't used to accompanying someone so obviously transparent. She gently covered her mouth with her left hand and clasped her hip bone with her right. She wrapped her arm around her waist like a boa constrictor clamping onto a gazelle. Oh, did it ever! Some guests even claimed to hear King George roaming the bowels of the ship, searching for his beloved Queen Mary. I found myself in good company with Hans. It was nice to know that someone else shared my taste for dark humor. On May 27, 1936, the Queen Mary departed from Southampton, England, embarking on her maiden voyage. It was the veritable who's who of the time: royals, celebrities, politicians. One of the tourists popped up to the front of the group and asked in an unamused tone of voice, "What makes it so haunted?" The peanut gallery started murmuring like the humming of a choir prior to a dress rehearsal. The tour guide was amused by the question and stopped abruptly at one of the doorways. He placed his hands together like a priest in the middle of a prayer. He slowly raised his head and looked up at the ceiling. "What makes it so haunted? Well, for starters, look up." The curious group of tourists looked up at the ceiling like a bunch of turkeys staring at the rain during a rainstorm. We all found ourselves oafishly looking up at the ceiling, but no one had the slightest clue as to why. It's funny how figures of authority have so much sway over large groups of followers. "You're all standing under a piece of history. This is the infamous Goldberg Corridor." The group of tourists looked back at the tour guide with some understandable confusion. "Since the first voyage in 1936, there have been 55 recorded deaths aboard the RMS Queen Mary, most of which were crew members." 55 deaths? In fact, the very first death was right about where you're standing at this very moment, Seaman Goldberg. The group subtly sidestepped the former resting place of Seaman Goldberg. The inner workings of the ship was a maze of iron and steel. It was quite the labyrinth. How did it happen? From the reports, it was a run-of-the-mill accident. Seaman Goldberg was discovered around midnight with a fractured skull and other various abrasions. A run-of-the-mill accident? Well, run-of-the-mill for the Queen, anyway, he said, and continued to walk down the corridor at a sluggish pace. Mike subtly nudged Kat and pulled her in close. During the war, she was nicknamed the Grey Ghost on account of her color and the swiftness of her speed. She not only transported troops under the cover of night, but ferried top military secrets between Churchill and Roosevelt. What kind of secrets? Story has it, on October 31st, 1942, the Mary collided head-on with another ship. Sadly, she was forced to leave its crew behind to die at sea. The ship had 430 total crew members. Only 99 of them managed to survive. Left them to die? One of the guests gasped at the gloomy fable. The tour guide started uncomfortably rubbing his jaw with his left hand. His hands were covered in a clammy sweat. I took it he didn't appreciate the guilt by association. The nickname, the Grey Ghost, was more than well deserved. It was a different time. It was a desperate time. It was a time of war. Kat pulled me in closer. I took it she was uneasy by the newfound lineage of her employer. The tour guide crept into center focus of the tour guests. He stood directly in front of two double doors and right under a sign that read, Ballroom. Who here likes to dance? Kat grabbed my hand and pulled us to the front of the pack. To be honest, I wasn't much of a dancer. Someone once told me I had 2 left feet and neither one of them knew how to dance. By all accounts, from my previous entanglements, that seemed to track. Good. You're all in for a treat, he said while pulling open the large double doors. The door made a large creaking sound as they careened open. We followed the tour guide into the ballroom, like a bunch of eager teenagers piling into a dance hall. The tour guide waltzed to the center of the dance floor and stood under a large circular light. The light laced the room in a dim white glow, just enough light to make out the rough details of the room's decor. From time to time, the ballroom has been known to host a special kind of guest. Over the years, thousands of guests have reported seeing a particular apparition. On one of those occasions, she was caught in a photograph, allegedly. Legend has it, as it goes, she was one of many upper-class socialites. Some guests report seeing her in the mirror of the first-class lounge. She looms over the dance floor, waiting for a dance partner that will never come, he said in an ominous tone of voice. How utterly tragic, Kat excreted emotionally. You could say that again, Mike replied. Now, follow me. On to the infamous room B474. Does anyone have the pleasure of staying in room B474? One of the guests at the back of the group reached into his pocket and pulled out a room key. The guest vigorously inspected the key, like a choir skimming over last-minute changes to a music sheet. To his dismay, the number scribbled down on the key was B474. He gulped and raised his hand into the air. We're in room B474. I'm going to have to apologize in advance. Please, right this way. The guests start blushing, and the group navigated out of the ballroom down to room B474. The ballroom was centrally located on the B floor. The hallways adorned a crimson and purple checkered patterned carpet. As we progressed towards room B474, the carpet acted more like an optical illusion rather than a yellow brick road. The handles of the doors had recently been polished. The newly finished shine of the brass doorknobs sparkled under the dimly lit hallway lights. The lights were vintage cast-iron Art Deco. Each light had 3 large, opal-shaped light bulb covers in a triangular pattern. As we passed from room to room, each of the guests quietly counted down the doors. On our left, the odd numbers, and on the right, the even-numbered rooms. B468, B470, B472, B474. Here we go. Now what you're about to hear is as tragic as it is true, so I do not say it lightly, nor do I say these things in jest. The words of the tour guide had a profound effect on the demeanor of the group. We stood poised and patiently waited entry into suite B474. I pulled Kat in close and whispered in her ear. You heard of this place or what? Can't say that I'm familiar. Now, without further ado, he said while opening the room up for further inspection. I had to say, my heart was skipping a beat or two. That kind of fluttering you get when you're about to get up in front of an audience and give a presentation. The door flung open to the suite. You could hear a pin drop in the hallway. The guests were as silent as family mourning an open casket. For inside the room was just a normal room. I'm not sure what all the fanfare was about. The room looked run-of-the-mill to me. I looked back at Kat and then over to the tour guide for some kind of cue. This is the infamous room B474. So, what's the story? The tour guide scoffed at my brazen question. I figured he wasn't thinking someone would have the gall to ask. I never basked in the misery of others' ignorance, but I was starting to get the feeling the tour guide derived some pleasure from being a know-it-all. It was a night, not too much unlike tonight. The salty sea air breeze blew through the hallways. The taste of the salty humidity was as palpable as it was potent. The tour guide stepped to the side of the room and placed his hands behind his back. He began to stare up at the ceiling and ponder his next line. It was clear he wanted to be intentional about his choice of words. How he managed to give the same speech hundreds of times per year and remain genuinely interested was beyond me. Room B474 looks like an ordinary room on its face. The beds are tucked away, the chairs put in their places, curtains drawn back, peaceful, pristine, and elegant. However, that all changed on the night of October 31st, 1967. Halloween? Yes, Halloween. The last Halloween voyage of the RMS Queen Mary. Legend has it, 4 passengers entered suite B474. By all accounts, healthy individuals. By all accounts, happy individuals. By all accounts... What happened? We don't know exactly. The crew reports were sketchy at best. However, foul play was suspected. You don't know what happened, but you suspect foul play? All we know for certain is that 4 individuals entered B474 on Halloween night, checked in for the voyage, and embarked from London to Long Beach. And none of them disembarked the voyage at the port of Long Beach. We know they ordered room service around 7 p.m. on Halloween night. The dinner was delivered at 7:45 p.m. to room B474. For all intents and purposes, the guests received the room service, tipped to the concierge, and were never seen again. Couldn't they have gotten off the ship and someone forgot to check them out? Unfortunately, no. No, they could not have. How can you be so certain? One of our employees, a deckhand, found the room abandoned mid-trip. That's how. We scoured the ship looking for the missing guests. At first, we assumed they were just walking around. After 10 hours of searching, we couldn't find a single trace of the passengers. They vanished, like ghosts in the darkness. Mike gazed around the room for any signs of a struggle or remnants of ancient clue. The other guests were flabbergasted by the tall tale. On its face, it wasn't elusively unbelievable, nor utterly inconceivable. Mike noticed out of the corner of his eye a curmudgeonly old woman mopping the deck. She looked completely out of place, even for a ghost tour. I gently slowed my pace and snagged onto Kat's arm with a warm embrace. She wrapped my arms snugly around her body. The soft touch of her silk dress was surprisingly cold as it was sleek. I slowly wandered over to the mysterious stranger like a child searching for a corner piece of a jigsaw puzzle scattered on the floor. "We don't see a lot of youngsters these days. What brings y'all by this evening?" she asked while mopping the deck. The question startled me at first. Normally, I found myself somewhat witty and quick on my feet. In this case, I had nothing to say. Kat stepped in and said, "My husband and I are celebrating our wedding anniversary." "Newlyweds, congratulations!" I put my infatuation aside and quickly began to play along with my new wife. I didn't figure someone like Kat would be so quick on her feet. It's that, or she really is crazy in the head. The good-looking ones almost always are. Yup, me and the old ball and chain. Thought we'd go out for a change and explore all that Long Beach had to offer. The deckhand discontinued her mopping and propped herself up by holding onto the top of the mop with both hands. The years of manual labor had taken a noticeable toll on the old lady. The decades of corrosive salty air soaked and stained her skin. The tips of her ends were split open like freshly mowed blades of grass. The deckhand scrunched her brow and asked, "You look familiar. Do we know each other?" "I don't think so. I just started at the front desk about a week ago." "Wonderful. I started at the front desk too. It was quite some time ago, though. About 1964 or 65. "That's some job security," Mike replied. "Well, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. That's what I always say." "How funny. My grandmother used to say the same thing," Kat delightfully declared to the sea hag. Your grandmother sounds like a smart cookie. You can say that again, Kat responded. You've probably seen quite a bit over that time. People, things, happenings, Mike said curiously. That's an understatement. I'm probably about to retire. Maybe 1 week or so to go. I just need to train my replacement and I can sail off into the sunset. Mike was somewhat flabbergasted by her proclamation. I mean, how could someone dedicate the better part of their life to working at the same company? I found the entire concept to be rather repulsive, yet reluctantly respectable. I don't want to be rude, but are you taking the ghost tour? The deckhand said. We are. The haunted ghost tour, Mike replied. Your tour group is galloping away, she said while pointing to the distant group. Oh yeah, we should probably get going. By all means, last thing I want to do is interrupt your fun. Get on and go enjoy your honeymoon. It was great meeting you, Mike said while waving back to the deckhand. Word for the wise. Don't want to get lost down here, kiddos. Kat and Mike scurried back to the tour group like a couple of ducklings flocking back to a gaggle of ducks. Luckily, the group was small enough to make the absence of the two people unnoticed. The weather report was a lot like tonight, actually. That is, of course, minus the terrifying torrential typhoon season. The typhoon season in '67 was as devastating as any in modern recorded history. The Queen left Southampton for the last time on 31st of October, 1967, and sailed to the port of Long Beach. Chapter 4, October 31st, 1967. Welcome to the RMS Queen Mary. Greetings and salutations. Good evening, darling, Mike Allen Sr. said while surrendering his boarding pass to the concierge. He swung his blazer over his right shoulder and leaned up against the desk. Mike wasn't very big on personal space. It was the 1960s, and he figured being formal was a way of the past. Mike Allen, here we go, the lanky concierge said while reading the name off the boarding pass. This is my first transatlantic voyage, Mike said in an attempt to drum up some rudimentary small talk with the front desk girl. You don't say. How exciting. You joined us on quite the most special of occasions, she said while running her fingers down the guest list. The lobby was brimming with a bodacious bevy of activity. Mike stuck out like a sore thumb. His presence was nowhere near as befitting as many of the other esteemed guests. The lobby was jam-packed with celebrities, debutantes, politicians, and various other social elites. The lobby was crammed up tight like toppings fighting over space on a supreme pizza. For a cop, Mike found the whole thing rather fantastical in nature. He was a man of simple tastes. He enjoyed top-shelf whiskey with bottom-shelf companions. Feeling a bit out of place? Darling, I'm feeling about as out of place as a bohemian in a boardroom. The concierge started gleefully giggling at Mike's colorful use of the English language. She took a second to appreciate his words, like a self-satisfied author stumbling upon a great simile. Embarkation is set promptly for 11:59 p.m. It looks like you have a reservation at Sir Winston's for 1 at 9 p.m. Oh, that's a mistake. Mistake? Oh no, what do you mean? I'd made plenty of mistakes in my time, darling. Not asking you to dine with me tonight won't be one of them. Without a moment's hesitation, the concierge glanced up from her desk. Her glasses were dancing on the brim of her nose. She slowly pushed up her glasses and stared at Mike with an intense interest. That's very presumptive of you, sir. My father goes by sir. You can call me Mike. You're impossible. Is that a yes? We'll see, she said while handing over the room key to Mike. He was satisfied enough in his remedial flirting skills to know he probably landed a companion for dinner. Mike tapped the key on the check-in desk and headed back to his room to freshen up. The room was centrally located about 50 yards from the front desk. After a quick walk down the main hallways, Mike arrived at his destination. The door to the room was made of a solid piece of maple and stained with a Purple Heart varnish. The sheen from the door reflected an outline of Mike's shadow, like viewing a silhouette through rose-colored glasses. Mike juggled his belongings while rummaging through his pockets for the room key. The hallway to the room was humid and as empty as a box of donuts left out at a police station break room. Mike pulled the key out and attempted to insert it into the keyhole. The tip of the key slashed against the keyhole a couple of times before it hit the target, like a rookie at the firing range sighting his target. Clearly, the drive time commute to Long Beach had weighed heavily on Mike. Luckily for Mike, he was too exhausted to be frustrated. As the door swung open, a backdraft of stuffy air wafted in Mike's face. The room was pitch black, and Mike adjusted his eyes to search around for the light switch. Anemic beams of light crept into the room from the hallway. Mike moved his hands along the wall to locate the switch. After searching around the wall like a blind man reading Braille, Mike accidentally toggled on the lights. The room was brilliantly blooming in a bountiful array of colors, like a randomly assorted bouquet of flowers. The tapestries flowed with an elegant pearly white intertwined thread. They wafted in the wind like the echoes of waves crashing against the rocks of a shallow seashore. Mike turned his eye toward the bed and fell backwards into it. The bed caught him like a baseball to a newly broken-in baseball glove. After a few moments of rest, Mike found himself dozing off to sleep, like a college student fighting the last-minute fatigue of cramming all night for a midterm exam. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking was as abrupt as it was shocking. He hopped up from the lumpy mattress and sprang towards the door. Without pretext, Mike swung open the door in eager anticipation. To his chagrin, he was met with the presence of a 6'9" bellhop. Hi. Good evening, sir. You aren't exactly who I was expecting. How can I help you? You left your bag at the front desk. Oh, thanks, Mike said and pulled out his money clip. He fawned through a wad of cash only to arrive at an inordinate amount of freshly minted $20 bills. The bills were as crisp as a newly ripened gala apple. He pulled out a 20 from the money clip and handed it over to the bellhop. The bellhop swapped the bag for the 20 and continued to shove it into his front breast pocket. By the way, Helen said she will meet you at 9 p.m. sharp. Mike smiled at the bellhop and pleasantly patted him on the shoulder. In the span of a few minutes, Mike was able to negotiate his way to Sir Winston's steakhouse. He sat eagerly at the table, waiting for the accompaniment of his soon-to-be dinner guest. The hands on his watch slowly paraded towards 9 p.m., like the slow, methodical marching of a soldier. Is this seat taken? Mike Allen turned his head and looked over his shoulder. He stood up and pulled out the chair for the lady. It was the 60s, the era of counterculture and challenging social norms. Mike was a little bit old school and maybe a little bit traditional, but he always found it stylish to show a modicum of chivalry. Have you eaten here before? Have I? No. Have I wanted to? Yes. Well, I'd have to say that we're in for quite the treat. How's that? I heard the Italian food is to die for. Pizza, pasta, pomodoro. If every country ate pizza, we'd have world peace by now. Helen clamped onto her wineglass and swirled it around in elongated concentric circles, like a figure skater making figure eights on an ice rink. The glass produced a luminescent glow that projected onto her white spaghetti string dress. She clutched her glass in her left hand, brushed back her bangs with her right hand. Mike appreciated her honesty and resumed his relentless assault on his food. Have some food with your salt, why don't you? Helen held the salt shaker in her hand and said, I love salt. Can't have a meal without it. Can I ask you something? I don't see why not. Dare I say you might be oversalting your food? Well, yeah, that's how I like it. Well, that begs the question. What question? How do you know to put salt on something if you haven't tasted it before? It needs more salt. Yes, but how do you know it needs more salt without trying it first? How do the tides work? Nobody knows. Tides roll in, tides roll out. Nobody knows why. Isn't it based on the moon or something? Who knows? I'm not an astronomer, but I think it's the moon. The moon? Not exactly my cup of tea. What exactly is your cup of tea? Let me guess. You're into flashy jewelry. What gave it away? Mike asked while rolling up his sleeves. His oversized gold-plated Cartier slid down his wrist and choked the top of his hand. Helen looked down at the watch and pointed with a stare. Fair enough, Mike said while turning over his wrist and unlatching the watch. He held up the watch as it beckoned in the dimly lit restaurant. Was it a gift? A gift? To put it mildly, it's a trinket. Spend 20 years on the job, and you get a boot to the trousers and a gold-plated watch. On the job? What do you do for a living? I'm a homicide detective in the homicide capital of the world. Well, I guess I was up until I retired last week. Ding, ding, ding. Ding, ding, ding. What's that? She asked. A captain's bell. Captain's bell? It's an all-hands-on-deck call to the crew. Something is rotten in Denmark. Mike keenly observed the area to assess the scene. Most of the guests remained seated and attuned to their food. Polite society tended to mind their own business, especially in times of acute distress. That was the thing about emergencies. They tended to be a litmus test. During an emergency, most people run away from the danger, and some people run towards the danger. Mike tended to jump headfirst into the fray like a scrappy boxer rushing to the center of the ring. Mike expeditiously excused himself from the table and rushed towards the sound of the bell. Crew members scattered from all parts of the ship like a flock of seagulls around an open dumpster. Mike firmly grabbed one of the fleeing deckhands by the arm sleeve. The deckhand looked back at Mike with an almost ghostly appearance on his face. What seems to be all the commotion about? Spit it out, son. I'm on the force. Maybe I can help, Mike said as he pulled out his detective shield and flashed it to the crewman. The deckhand pulled him in close and said, We have an emergency. Son, an emergency. Be more specific. What happened? He asked while posting the ends of his fingertips into the man's chest cavity. We have reports of a missing cabin full of passengers. A family, sir. How can I help? You want to help? Then follow me. Mike and the deckhand raced over to the bridge like a race car pulling away from a pit stop. The various crew members had abandoned their post and funneled into the bulkhead around the bridge. The Queen hoisted over 25 lifeboats on the port side of the ship. As he ran, the capacious hallways became cluttered with crew. The bulkhead leading to the bridge was bustling with activity. Mike slowed down to survey the area as he made his approach. Captain! The deckhand shouted in a sultry tone of voice. The captain's attention was trained on a map of the ship. He was scouring the map for an idea where to look for the missing passengers. Mike stood adjacent to the captain, just outside his periphery view. The captain raised his right hand and placed it in front of the deckhand without saying a word. His focus was completely concentrated on the map like a hunter staring down the scope of a rifle before a kill. Captain, how long? Mike asked. The captain broke his myopic concentration and turned his head to the stranger. Who is this man, and why is he on my bridge? Someone please explain to this passenger. Detective, my name is Detective Mike Allen. Oh, well, how nice. Well then, Detective Mike Allen, in case you weren't aware, you probably don't have jurisdiction in international waters. That badge says Long Beach Police Department, and you are smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Please be a good American and see yourself to your cabin. By all means, Captain, Mike said casually, walking off the bridge. As he passed the thresholds of the bridge to the galley, he turned and shouted, How long? Okay, I'll bite. How long? How long for what? If I answer your question, will you kindly vacate my bridge? You have 48 hours to solve this case. If you don't have a lead or a suspect within the first 48 hours, your chances of solving the case drops by 99%. I'll take that under advisement, he said dismissively to the desperate detective. The captain waved off the detective and continued searching the map for some inspiration. You can stare at that map all day. You have over 2,100 guests and 1,100 crew members scattered across 12 decks. This boat is luxurious, but time is not a luxury you have on your side. Every minute we stand here with our dicks in our hand is one less minute we find those passengers. The captain stubbornly scratched the brim of his nose and readjusted his glasses. The captain raised his hand and led Mike back into the room. How long? We think somewhere after 7 p.m. Let's walk this back. How do you know they're missing? The passengers ordered room service at 7 p.m. John, our bellhop, delivered it, and that was that. That was that? That was that. What happened then? We figure somewhere between 7 and 9 the passengers went missing. Figure? Figure how? The passengers in the cabin across the hall called into guest services somewhere around 9 p.m. The door to the room was left wide open. We sent up a deckhand to investigate. And I take it, the room was empty when your deckhand showed up. Not exactly. Captain, I appreciate your candor, but I believe we are well beyond pleasantries and euphemisms. Shall we dispense with the bullshit? Very well. The captain adjusted his uniform by pulling down on the bottom of his tie, like an Egyptian pharaoh repositioning a monolithic menhir. The room. It was covered from floor to ceiling in blood. The captain instinctively started speaking with his hands to emphasize his words. Mike instinctively gulped and started rubbing his hands together in this slow, awkward rhythm. I'll need to speak with the bellhop and the deckhand immediately. Of course. John, front and center. Sir. The bellhop leapt next to the captain. This is Detective Mike Allen. He has some questions for you, son. Sir, I didn't see nothing. Mike interrupted the crewman and said, Sometimes the smallest details can make the biggest difference. You may not even know what you know. Okay. How can I help? Just tell me what happened, son. At approximately 7 p.m., Son, plain language. Tell me what happened in your own words. I went to deliver the food. The husband opened the door, and I rolled the cart into the room. What did they order? Cheeseburgers, fries, and milkshakes. Did he tip? The captain interjected for a moment. What does that matter? The bellhop scrunched his eyebrows and stared despondently down at the ground. I'm just trying to get a read of the situation. Mike slightly turned his head to the captain and shook his head. The captain immediately picked up on the cue and obliged the bellhop to answer. Son, answer the man's question. He did. Generously, the bellhop responded. So, husband opens the door, you walk the food in, he tips you, and you walk out. Yeah, like I said, I didn't see nothing out of the ordinary. Just a family having dinner. Mike slowly stroked his chin and pondered the situation. Tell me, how long have you been working on the Queen? Oh, this is I'd say going on 5 years now. So, you're familiar with the layout of the rooms? Familiar? You know, familiar. Do you have a good lay of the land? Could you tell if something was obviously out of place? Oh, yes, I'm very familiar with the room layout, sir. Was anything out of place? Anything at all? So far as I could tell, the room looked kempt. I was only there for a matter of minutes. Very good. That'll be all, sailor. John nodded at the detective and saluted the captain. The captain pulled Mike aside for a moment and asked, What does it matter what they ate? Lust, loathing, loot, and love. There are only 4 motives for murder. What does it matter what they ate? It didn't. I wanted to gauge his response. I wanted to read his body language. I wanted to sniff out my inconsistencies in his story. Well? He passed with flying colors. He's clean as a whistle. You pick your people well, Captain. How can you tell? His clothes, uniform, shoes, are all spotless. Not a drop of blood on him. No signs of a struggle. No signs he did anything other than deliver cheeseburgers and milkshakes. I see. Like I said, clean as a whistle. So now what? Now we speak to your deckhand. Ah, yes. Olivia. Olivia Marie, I think her name is. Mike looked away from the map and turned to the captain with a spark of curiosity. You have a female deckhand? Interesting. She's an acquired taste from what the crew tells me. I haven't spent much time with her myself. Where is she? She's right out there on the deck. Well, no time like the present. Let's get her in here. The captain pointed at Olivia from the bridge and walloped a wholehearted whistle. She sprang into action and jogged into the bridge. She had a noticeable bulge around her waistline, almost like she shoved a pillow down her trousers. What's your name, sailor? Sir? She asked in a confused tone. It's okay, sailor. This is Detective Mike Allen. He's helping us locate the missing passengers. Olivia stood at attention with her arms crisscrossed behind her well-pronounced shoulders. For a deckhand, she sure fit the archetypal mold. Olivia Marie, sir. Olivia, I need your help with something. We're somewhat behind the 8-ball and working on a truncated timetable. I'm going to ask fast questions and I expect some fast answers. You do that and we can be square. Mike shoved his hands into his pockets and rummaged around for a lighter. He pulled the nickel-plated Zippo from his right pocket and a pack of menthols from his left. It was a nasty habit, but often helped calm his nerves. Mike fidgeted around with the cigarettes while sizing up the deckhand. I'm not sure I can help, sir. See, I just found the empty room. Well, not exactly empty. Mike prudently persisted with his pause. He always found solace in the awkward silence among strangers. Pausing often revealed the true intentions of a suspect. Make someone awkward enough, and they'll spill their deepest and darkest secrets. Mike loudly and intentionally flicked the Zippo open and closed. The Zippo made a distinctive clicking sound. Tell me, what happened? Sometime around 9 p.m., I was called to conduct a routine wellness check on a guest. And I checked on the guests. And I arrived at the room around 9:15. It was, you know. It was what? You know. Humor me, Miss Marie. It was covered completely in blood and bile. Elaborate if you would be so kind, Mike said while tamping down his cigarette carton. I'm not sure what to say. Say whatever comes to mind, dear. Nothing more, nothing less. The walls, they were covered in blood. The ceilings, the floor, the entire room was soaked in thick black crimson blood, Olivia Marie said while flailing her arms around like a couple of soggy pool noodles listing lazily in a pool. But no bodies. She put her hands on top of her head and said, Bodies? Sir, I saw blood, turned tail, and ran. No bodies, just blood. There was so much blood. Interesting. Mike took a moment to digest her disjointed answer. He pulled the unlit cigarette from his mouth and started twirling it between his fingers like a drummer twirling a drumstick. I think I'd like to see the room now. Mike stared at the crew members for some guidance. No one budged an inch. He was confused by the lackluster response or sense of urgency from his crew. There was an abnormal amount of passive resistance to his request. For a detective of his caliber, this seemed like a rather benign request. Can we go to the room? When? The captain asked. When? No time like the present. Chapter 5. November 1st, 1967. Step aside, sailor. The sailor glanced down at Mike Allen with a hefty hue of hesitation. He stood 6'3" and nearly hit the lantern hanging from the hallway ceiling. The sailor was backlit, and Mike stood under the better part of his shadow. He held himself well, shoulders back and chest puffed out. As far as Mike was concerned, the bigger they were, the harder they fall. The sailor stood at attention, with his hands firmly clasped behind the curvature of his lower back. "Son, don't make me ask you a second time. I don't have time for exposition nor incompetence," he said while pulling out his detective shield. Mike flapped open his leather badge and dangled the badge in front of the sailor. "Sir, I don't know you from Adam. I was told to guard this bulkhead until the captain came back to relieve me of duty. Those are my orders, and I'm sticking to them." Evidently, the seaworthy sailor remained agnostic in his agreeableness. He didn't budge an inch. He probably figured Mike was all show and no go. Thud, 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 thud. The captain came marching down the corridor like a heat-seeking missile homing in on its target. His steel-toed boots made a lasting impression on the ambiance of the hallway. The sailor leaned over to inspect the corridor. He immediately recognized the sound of the boots. More often than not, those boots were a dog whistle to the crew to get back to work. "Sailor, make a hole." The sailor picked up his knee and sidestepped to the anterior part of the hallway. "This is the room, huh?" "Room B474. This is the room," he said while opening the door. Mike placed his hand on the back shoulder of the curmudgeonly captain. The captain huffed a deep breath as he fondled the doorknob. There was an uneasy hesitation to his hand, like the nervous hand of a 17-year-old pinning a brooch to his prom date. "Let me take over here," Mike said while relieving the captain of the burden of opening the door to the crime scene. The captain did what he did best, which is to say he delegated work to his subordinates. He nodded in confirmation. Mike quickly glanced around the room to look for clues. If there was one thing he learned working crime scenes, it was you don't want to miss the forest for the trees. Sometimes the smallest detail can make the biggest difference. The stench of the blood-stained blankets soaked the air like a malfunctioning sauna. Mike stuck up his hand in the air and motioned the captain into the room. The captain stepped through the doorway with a cautious tone. "Captain, do me a favor." The captain looked at Mike Allen with a confused expression. The furry brows of his forehead were neatly plucked, like a well-pruned bonsai tree. "Look at your feet." "Oh. Oh is right. How many footprints do you see?" "At least, 10 sets of footprints? Maybe more." "That's precisely my point. Yours, mine, the family's, the bellhop. I need a list of everyone who entered this room. I need a list of anyone and everyone who worked this deck." "Sailor, on the double." The captain snapped his finger and the sailor stepped into the room. He extended his hand over to the captain with a list of names on it. The sailor was prancing around the room trying to avoid tampering with the crime scene. Mike was somewhat skeptical about the finicky finalization of his request. Any time information was received with that kind of speediness, there was often more to the story than meets the eye. "Thanks." Mike snatched the list from the captain and pulled it close to his face. He dragged his index finger down the list, read the names aloud. "Captain Jones, Seaman Brody, Olivia Marie." The list wasn't as fruitful as Mike initially inspected. Mike partially crumpled the list and handed it back to the captain. Mike imagined this is how Robert E. Lee must have felt when surrendering at Appomattox. He took a deep, deliberate breath and intentionally inhaled warm sea air. The air had a toughness to it, like the aroma produced after cooking a steak on a frying pan. "This isn't much to go on," Mike said while kneeling down to get a better lay of the land. The sailor spontaneously slapped his knee in response to the comment. Mike spent an entire career beating the odds, breaking the mold and shattering expectations. Without a moment's break in concentration, Mike asked, "Something funny?" "Other than a detective complaining about not having enough evidence to work a case." Mike scoffed his response and slowly stood up. There was a palpable stench sautéing the air with an aroma of stink. Blood had a way of ruining an ambiance. I'm glad you can find some humor in this situation. Look, son, I was handed this mess. If you want to explain to the Port Authority how you were one of the 3 people who discovered the crime scene, then I can walk away right now and call it a day. The captain stepped back into the conversation by grabbing the sailor by the arm and whispering something into his ear. Mike had considerable amount of experience with a good ear chewing. He considered getting chewed out par for the course when working for the government. Public service wasn't glamorous by any means, but it held a certain credulity with Mike. Even the best workers ended up getting chewed out once in a blue moon. How can we help? At this point, I fear the worst. The worst? Based on the sheer volume of blood, spatter patterns, and time. The captain sighed in disappointment. Mike instinctively grabbed his chin and rubbed it intensely. You've been here 5 minutes, and you're giving up on us? Captain! Some detective. You believe this guy? Mike took his hands and rubbed them along the side of his head. He slicked back his hair and clasped his hands behind his head. He looked around the room for a moment for any semblance of a clue. In a moment of clarity, he asked, Where's Olivia? Olivia? She was the first in the room, was she not? The captain turned to the sailor and pointed at him. Without hesitation, the sailor jumped into high gear and escorted Olivia into the room. She immediately ran to the corner of the room and dry heaved like a cat with a fur ball stuck in his mouth. Mike did an about face and questioned the young deckhand. The way Mike figured it, never let a good tragedy go to waste. He squatted down in front of Olivia. Tell me what happened again? Like I told you before, I just opened the door to find all of this. Then what happened? What do you mean? I mean, tell me what happened after that. Olivia paused for a moment and said, Nothing. I just left the room. What was I supposed to do? Just like that. You got up and left. I got up and left. You stumble onto what is obviously a crime scene, and you just left. Like I said. Did you turn the lights back off? The lights were on when I entered the room. So you kept them on? I wasn't thinking of the utility bill when I ran out of the room. I was scared out of my mind and ran for the bridge. Mike started tapping on the floor with his left foot. Tap, tap, tap. Now we're getting somewhere. You see the blood. You frantically run out of the room. Did you see any other guests? Other guests? The hallways were empty. No one. No one. You arrive at the room. No other guests come out of the room. You run out of the room in a commotion. No one comes out of their rooms. Look, mister, I don't know how many times you plan on asking me the same question in a different way. I told you what I saw. Nothing. I wish I could be more helpful, but I didn't see anything. That'll be all, darling, Mike said while hoisting his hand towards the door like a bouncer lowering a velvet rope for a VIP. Olivia scurried out of the room like a mouse running away with a piece of cheese. She had this unusual waddle, almost like a limp. Captain, if I may have a word in private, Mike asked. He gestured over to the captain, with a nothing more than an expression. The captain leaned in and asked, What's our situation? Mike gave it to the captain how he ate sushi, which is to say, raw. We have 2 non-witnesses, a tarnished crime scene, and 4 missing bodies. The captain nodded his head at the bleak assessment of the situation. The captain was a man of action. He appreciated the lack of foreplay. So what you're saying is, you found nothing. I'm saying we have a truncated timetable, a crime scene that is about as fucked up as a soup sandwich and no leads. What are you suggesting exactly? That being said, we need to scour the boat for some kind of clue or sign of life. And what? Try not to panic the thousands of guests on board in the process? There'll be a mutiny on our hands if this gets out. There are 4 motives for murder, Captain. Lust, love, loot, and loathing. It's safe to say we can rule out love, lust, and loot. How do you figure? Presumably, no one heard so much as a peep. This was a fast attack under the cover of darkness. Was this a crime of passion? The bodies are all missing and there's no fingerprints to be found. Lust? I think not, sir. Not on a cruise of this magnitude. Everyone who is on this boat is here for a reason, not by accident. A cruise that keeps meticulous records of passengers and staff, Mike said while trailing off. He pulled out a pen from his lapel and started prodding various parts of the mattress. Tell me, Captain, when you look at these blood spatters, what do you see? What do I see? What kind of question is that? Tell me, what do you see? What I see is violence, sir. I see violence. You know what I see? No, I don't have the slightest idea. What do you see? Precision, elegance, catharsis. No, Captain, this is a serial killer we have on our hands here. These weren't the strikes of an angry man. These were the strikes of a crazy man. These weren't the strikes of a rank amateur. You seem pretty certain the killer is a man. We suspect there are dozens, maybe hundreds of active serial killers in America. What we are sure of is that all known serial killers end up being men. This was no crime of convenience. This was clearly a crime of methodical planning. A plan that was interrupted by... Interrupted? By what? By what? By whom? That's what I intend to find out. Mike squatted down to inspect one of the blood-laden footprints. From the looks of it, it was a man's shoe, but couldn't have been more than a size 7 or 8. Mike pulled out his wallet and flipped through some freshly minted dollar bills. He pulled out one of the bills, examined it for a second, and snapped both ends. He delicately pasted the bill down next to the footprint. What you got there, Alan? The captain said in an authoritative baritone. Mike looked back to the captain and said, At this point, nothing but a hunch. A hunch. Okay, what can I do? The captain's request was followed by a harrowing sigh. Mike pulled the bill from the ground and gently ran his fingers through his hair. Buy me some time, Captain. Can you do that? The captain leaned up against the door jamb and started tapping his index finger on the door frame. Mike could see him working out the problem in his head. Time. How much time do you need? I can only slow the boat for so long without people starting to ask questions. Crime scene investigation in the best of circumstances was as much art as it was science. Mike had worked thousands of crime scenes over the years, but this was the first crime scene that floated. Mike planted his hands firmly on his knees and bounced back up from his squatted position. Now was not the time for observation. Now was not the time for pontification. Now was the time for action. Figured a man like you was apt at deflecting unwelcome questions. The captain beamed a smile. He clearly appreciated Mike's moxie and replied curtly, Fair enough. What's our ETA? ETA is approximately 9, maybe 10 hours tops. Whatever you plan on doing, detective, I hope you do it quick. Mike shook his head and said with an exacting tone of voice, I'll need the entire ship. An escort for the evening. No questions asked. The captain was a man of rigid ideology, but shrewd enough to realize the sand was shifting beneath his feet. He placed his left hand on Mike's shoulder and whispered, Whatever you need to solve this case, consider it done. Without a moment's delay, Mike accepted the offer and said, I need someone quick on their feet, someone who can take orders, someone who knows this boat like the back of their hand. The captain nodded and stuck his head down the hallway. The hallway was littered with personnel attempting damage control with the noisier guests. First Mate Hodges, front and center. A younger-than-expected sailor pranced to the front of the doorway. He peered his head in for a moment and locked eyes with Mike Allen. Sir? First Mate, this is Detective Mike Allen. You are to stick on him like glue. He moves, you move. Wherever he needs to go, you take him. Whatever he needs, you get it. Understood? Sir, what in by George is going on? Protesting an order wasn't a muscle the first mate exercised very often. Like any underdeveloped muscle, if you don't use it, it gets very weak. For the next 9 hours, help Detective Allen with whatever he needs. Copy that? The first mate was well aware that disobeying orders was a pretext to mutinous insurrection. He was keenly attuned to the fact that this wasn't the Queen's Royal Navy, but would still suffer undue consequences for openly dejecting the captain's orders. Sir, yes, sir. Chapter 6. November 2nd, 1967. Where do you want to start? We start in the engine room and we work our way up. And what are we looking for exactly? Who, not what. Okay, who are we looking for exactly? You're what, 25? 26? I'm 29 years old. Let me guess. You're about 6'3", 6'2". And what? About 220? Good guess. What does that have to do with anything? Your shoe size. My shoe size? What about it? By the looks of it, your boots are size 13. Harry fucking Houdini. Not quite. What would you guess the average male shoe size is? Over or under 10? Over for sure. 10 and a half. Great. So what's your point? You've been first mate for how long now? 5 years. In those 5 years, have you seen a lot of sailors with a size 8 shoe? The first mate started laughing at the absurd non sequitur. Can't say. Haven't given it much thought? Not in the least. Precisely my point. The small details often make the biggest difference, but most people drift through life without even noticing. First Mate Hodges pulled out his loop of keys. The keys jingled and jangled as he flipped through them to find the elevator key. He moved through the loop like a secretary scanning Rolodex. One of the keys was tagged as elevator. Hodges pulled it out like a ripe cherry tomato fresh off the vine. In that room, there were maybe a dozen or so footprints, one of which was a size 8 boot. You know a lot of sailors walking around here wearing a size 8 boot? I don't know about you, but seems rather peculiar to me. I see your point. I don't rely on luck. I rely on statistics. I rely on odds. I play the odds and take a bet. First Mate Hodges stuck his hand out and asked, "What floor?" Let's start from the bottom and work our way to the top. The way I figure it, we have just under 9 hours to light a fire under the unsub. Unsub? Unidentified suspect. Ah. You ever play hide and seek? The kids' game? Yeah, that's the one. It's been about 20 years. The thing about hide and seek is that everyone tends to have a reliable favorite spot to hide. Think of this like an elaborate game of hide and seek. Put yourself in the killer's shoes. You commit a quadruple murder. Where do you go? First Mate Hodges scratched his chrome dome for a minute. Clearly he was lost in deep contemplation. Where would I go? The obvious spot would be the engine room. Tell me why. It's loud, humid, dimly lit, and everyone minds their business. The engineers are too busy working on keeping the ship moving to notice anything out of the ordinary. It's a mess down there. Where's the next best spot? Next best. I'd say the cargo hold in the forward bow. Plenty of ways in and plenty of ways out. It's a veritable maze of scattered suitcases. A lot of crew in the cargo hold? Not really. It operates on a skeleton crew, more or less. So, we're stuck between an engine room and a cargo hold. If I were a betting man, I'd put my money on the engine room. The engine room it is. Lead the way, sailor. First Mate Hodges obliged the detective with an affirmative nod and began to fiddle with the controls of the elevator. The elevator was controlled by a single gold-plated lever with various markings etched onto the device. Hodges yanked down on the lever like an arm wrestler slamming an opponent's hand down. The two men stumbled back a bit as the elevator plummeted towards the engine room. Mike braced himself and grabbed onto one of the conveniently placed handrails. In typical sailor bravado, Hodges locked out his knees and stood at attention. Bravado was a young man's game, and Mike was in the twilight of his career. As the men made their descent into the inner bowels of the ship, each floor was distinctively marked by the clang of a bell. Clang, clang, clang. First Mate Hodges attempted to break the silence by spouting out some superstitious mumbo-jumbo. This vessel, she claimed so many lives over the years. Too many. Mike looked back at the first mate with a certain level of skepticism. The elevator light reflected off of his head like a newly shined bowling ball. It's haunted. Don't tell me you believe in ghost stories. Stories? I've seen it with my own eyes. Clang, clang, clang. Seen it? And what is it exactly? This boat has a ledger, you see. A ledger written in blood. A ledger. The detective was understandably skeptical of the first mate's allegation. Bromides aside, the detective decided to prolong the conversation. At this point, shoe size or not, Mike couldn't rule out any of the crewmen. The Queen. She's claimed so many lives over the years. Son, workplace accidents happen all the time. Would you qualify what happened up there in the suite as a workplace accident? Clang, clang, clang. Would I? Depends on the circumstances of the accidents. Whirr. A loud screeching sound rang out as the first mate slammed down on the operator's handle. Circumstances? Well, did you witness any of these accidents? Did I? No, not personally. But some did happen under your watch. Under my watch? I didn't become first mate because I have schlock for brains. To a fancy detective, that might not mean anything, but on this boat, that means something. Don't forget it. Mike noticed the back of the first mate's hand began to turn pale as a ghost. He clamped onto that lever harder than a hippo chomping away at a watermelon. As the first mate reversed the lever back to the engine room, he pulled back his sleeve just enough for Mike to notice a fresh cut on the outer crest of his right wrist. Occupational hazard? Mike said while pointing to the freshly concealed wound. I know what you're getting at, and I don't care for it. Clang, clang, clang. Mike learned an invaluable lesson from sparring the great Willie Pep in a boxing match. He who hits and runs away lives to fight another day. For now, his verbal lashing was stymied for the time being. The way Mike figured it, the first mate was clean. At least he was clean enough. See, you learn a thing or two on the beat. For instance, Mike learned that the quickest way to light a fuse was insinuating someone for something and wait for the fireworks. In this case, the first mate passed that test with flying colors. He kept a cool head, but stood his ground to defend his honor. He didn't fly off the handle, nor did he cower in a bevy of lies. Luckily for Mike, the elevator slowed to a snail's pace and calmly sunk to the bottom of the vessel. We've arrived. So it would seem. I hope you're as good as you think you are. I guess we're both about to find out. First Mate Hodges snatched the handle of the accordion-style elevator door like a fishmonger clasping onto the fresh catch of the day. The door wasn't amenable to delicate touches. It took brute force to free it from the locked position. Luckily, Hodges had plenty of it to spare. He jerked on the door and forced it open. After you, he said with his arm extended out with an inviting motion. You're too kind, kid, Mike said as he departed the elevator. He gingerly stepped further into the engine room, making sure to not get too far ahead of himself. The first mate was meant to be an escort, not a shadow. The engine room had the ambiance of a graveyard at the stroke of midnight. Lanterns and cisterns filtered incandescent light like a flashlight filtered through a kaleidoscope. Mike took another tepid step onto a staircase. The steel had become moist from years of uncleaned soot and humidity. "You've seen the first-class cabins. Welcome to the working class," the first mate said while pulling a flashlight from his back pocket. He flipped the on switch only to be met with a half-working flashlight. It flickered on and off, like an old radio attempting to keep a frequency. Mike extended his helping hand out to the first mate and snatched the flashlight from his grasp. Mike looked it over one time and slapped the head of the flashlight with his palm, like a parent gently calming a gassy newborn. Just like that, the flashlight sprung back into life and faithfully fulfilled its duty. Mike smirked and handed it back to the first mate. "Where, oh where has my little lamb gone? Oh where can it be?" Mike asked quietly while scouting out the engine room for possible clues. He planted his hands firmly onto his hips like a stoic college football coach. First Mate Hodges hoisted his flashlight from floor to ceiling, looking to light up the room. "Where to?" "We need to scour every crevice of this room." "That might take some time, Detective." "It'll take a lot less time if we quit squawking and start searching." Without a word spoken, the men bolted into action and sped off into the engine room, like a Formula One car spinning out of a pit stop. The men searched high, the men searched low. The men searched for what they did not know. First Mate Hodges took a moment to collect himself. Apparently, the aimless searching had paid a heavy toll on the young first mate. In all reality, it was probably the triple-digit temperature that weighed heavily on the young man. "How do you do it?" "What? Be a detective?" "Yeah, how do you do it? How do you deal with all the death?" "Dealing with death isn't easy, but it's a lot easier if you can bring justice for the victim." "If?" "If." First Mate Hodges glanced over to the corner of the room and spun his flashlight over to get a better look. Mike?" Mike looked back at the first mate with an exhausted expression. The first mate spotted something rather unusual sitting in the corner of the room. There was a brownish-red duffel bag stuffed into the corner of the engine room. Mike placed his hand on the chest of the first mate, like the instinctive reaction of a mother staring down a head-on collision and placing her hand over her child's chest before the crash. Mike wandered over the duffel bag, making sure to keep a tedious recollection of his steps. The last thing he wanted to do was trample a potential crime scene. "Keep the light on me. Stay here," he said to the first mate. Hodges stood fast and steady. The flashlight was shaking up and down as Mike approached the bag. Mike looked back at the first mate in an attempt to calm his obviously shook nerves. Mike pulled out a ballpoint pen from his front breast pocket and started poking around the bag. He gently poked and prodded the duffel bag without saying a word. Mike was unable to discern any odor from the bag, which was probably due to the heavy aroma of musk wafting in the engine room. Mike pulled back the outer rim of the duffel bag with delicate precision, like a groom nervously pulling down a garter belt. Mike pulled the pen out of the bag and placed it back into his pocket. "What is it?" "It's a sign." "A sign?" "Don't quit your day job," Mike said as he pulled the bag around to show the first mate. To the first mate's surprise, it was a bag full of undergarments. "Okay, Mr. Detective, tell me something." "Something? Something about what? About these undergarments?" "About me." "Ah, happenstance. I love it. Okay, what would you like to know about yourself?" Mike asked while framing a portrait around the first mate with his hands. "Crime, like life, is about odds. Not chance, but odds. You're young and ambitious." "That's not telling me much." Mike smirked at the lugubrious nature of the first mate. It was an all-too-familiar feeling that he could empathize with. "I'd say you're a middle child." "Good guess." "Life is an odds game. I played the odds. About 25% of children are middle children. I took a shot based on all the available data." Available data? Mike smiled and said, "You keep your shoulders back. You are froth at the mouth with ambition. You have a moderate to high respect for detail. The seams on your uniform have the telltale sign of anal retentiveness. You care about what people think about your appearance. Like I said, all the telltale signs of a middle child." Those are telltale signs? Believe it or not, 52% of all United States presidents were middle children. To be such a young, presumably competent leader, it was a safe assumption that you are a middle child. I'll be damned. Now, speaking of odds, we're burning the candle at both ends and we seem to be up the creek without a paddle. What do you suggest? I suggest we finish our dawdling and move on, Mike said with a hint of doom and drudgery. The air was thickened by the humidity of the steam boilers, engines, and furnaces. Mike's pace slowed to a snail's crawl, like a pack-a-day smoker trying to run a marathon. First Mate Hodges noticed Mike's impingement and slowed his pace in kind. Mike took a moment to catch his breath and drum up some small talk. Could you imagine working down here? Don't have to imagine. I started my career over near that very cistern. The cistern was covered in grime, soot, and rust. There was a rusted, covered circular shutoff valve attached to a recently replaced pressure gauge. The cistern stood in the center of the room and obstructed most of the throughways in the engine room. Mike had little appreciation for the lack of unintended consequences in the obvious design flaw, but had little motivation to bring it up with the first mate. How do you deal with it all? There was a time when I was young, dumb, and full of cum. When I was a rookie, I was more of an idealist. I wanted to change the world, one caper at a time. What happened? I realized the truth. The truth? Mike took a deep breath and slowly exhaled as if to lift the weight of the world off his shoulders in one swell breath. Human nature. Yeah? What about it? My first ride along was a drug raid on the Long Beach Pier that ended up in a gunfight. We received a tip from an informant that a street gang had procured 100 kilos of heroin. Turns out it was nothing but a bunch of kids. We showed up. They scattered to the wind. Somehow I ended up on the receiving end of a revolver. I took 3 in the leg and 1 in the head. It was a miracle I survived. Groovy. Not quite. The point is, you can go around trying to change the world, but odds are it'll end up changing you. The two men leaned up against the cistern to contemplate their next move. Time was working against them, almost as much as the humidity. Mike looked at his grizzled guide and opined, "It would appear our investigation of the engine room here has run its course." What's next? You gonna start talking in the third person? That sarcastic retort was just what Mike needed to get his head back in the game. A little added fuel for the fire, like spraying some lighter fuel on a dimming campfire. Cargo hold, Mike said with a renewed sense of vigor for the chase. Cargo hold avante, Hodges replied in kind. Mike smiled at his compatriot and headed back towards the elevator. You speak Italian? You learn a couple things traveling across the world. Tu parli l'italiano? Si. I'm a little rusty. Alan doesn't sound very Italian. Not enough vowels, Hodge said while trailing off. Believe it or not, when my mother came over from Sicily, the government changed her last name at Ellis Island. Maria Allendrato became Mary Allen. Hodges shook his head at the idea of arbitrarily changing someone else's name. A name is precious. It represents a lineage, a heritage, a bond. It was a different time back in the early 20th century. A different time. Seems so long ago. A lot's changed. A lot stayed the same. Fair, Mike said as he opened the accordion door to the elevator. The outer perimeter of the door had begun to sweat like a whore in church. Mike and Hodges hopped into the elevator like brothers fighting over who gets to stand in front of the open refrigerator in a house with no air conditioning. The elevator raced up to the cargo hold. In no short order, the men had arrived at the ship's forward cargo hold. Hodges opened the door, but held his hand back, belaying Mike from stepping off first. He looked both ways and stepped off with some trepidation for his new destination. Something's not right. Hodges struck his flashlight with the palm of his hand. The metal flashlight clapped against his hand like the clacking of a brass shell casing smacking the ground after being freshly ejected from a shotgun. The light from his flashlight wasn't dependable, but it was effective. It hobbled back to life and glimmered around the room. Mike peered his head out of the elevator and squinted his eyes. There was an aroma unlike any that he had smelt before. He cautiously followed his would-be guide into the cargo hold. "What is it?" "It's empty, sir." "That was kind of the point, wasn't it?" "It's too empty." "Interesting." Drip, drip, drip. Mike looked at his shoulder and patted off some falling droplets of condensation from the ceiling. As he patted down his peacoat, he noticed a discoloration on his palm. On first inspection, he assumed it was grime. He inspected it closely, like a scientist sighting in the magnification of a microscope. "First mate." First mate Hodges turned on a dime, like a shortstop pivoting to throw a runner out at second base. He honed his flashlight on Mike Allen, like a prison guard flashing a floodlight spotting an escaped convict. Mike held out his hand to inspect the droplets in the dimly lit cargo hold. "What do you got?" Mike slowly looked up towards the ceiling with the same hesitation he felt on his first ride-along. A jolt of energy tingled up his limbs. His hands turned clammy and his skin pale as a ghost. Mike took a big gulp and pointed towards the ceiling. First Mate Hodges followed the finger like a hound following the scent of an escaped convict. He shined the flashlight onto the ceiling to find a pool of red liquid on the ceiling. "Jesus H. How do we get to the next floor?" "Follow me." The two men ran towards one of the poorly lit corridors that led to a stairwell. Luckily for the duo, the cargo hold was less obtusely designed than the engine room. The design flaws were about as emblematic as the endless tales of demise. "This ladder, it goes to the next floor," he said while grabbing onto a maintenance ladder. Mike brushed his hand from the ladder, only to receive a perplexed look on the face of the young first mate. Mike posted his shoe onto the ladder and pulled out his nickel-plated revolver from his ankle holster. "I don't know about you, but I don't plan on going up there just holding my dick in my hand." Hodges nodded and stood fast at the base of the ladder. "I'm going up. Stay down here and wait for me to clear the room." Hodges took a deep breath and focused his light on the porthole at the top of the ladder. Mike tucked the revolver into the back of his waistband and started climbing up the ladder. The outer rungs of the ladder were crusted with a rosy bronze. Years of neglect had worn away the coating on the ladder rungs. Mike grabbed each rung with a sturdy tenacity, like the subtle caressing of a hangman's noose. The back of his hands turned pale white as he clamped onto each rung. Sweat rolled down both sides of his hands, making each preceding climb unnecessarily difficult on the detective. Mike swung open the hatch at the top of the ladder. He placed one hand on the top rung and one on his revolver. Mike jumped into the fray with his pistol drawn, like Butch Cassidy rushing out of the cantina with guns blazing. He swung around to his left. Nothing. He swung around to his right. Nothing. He looked up. Nothing. He scoured every corner of the room like a dog sniffing out crumbs on the dining room floor. He decocked his revolver and placed it back into his waistband. The silence was a deafening omen that echoed through the bowels of the ship. Mike popped his head out and hovered it over the open hatch, like a whack-a-mole popping out of a hole. His face was clammy and moist, like a freshly doused paint roller dripping droplets of water-based flat Swiss coffee. Mike stared down the hatch at the eagerly awaiting first mate. He wiped the sweat from his brow and began to exfiltrate the hatch back on down the ladder. His descent was as bumpy as a 747 landing in a snowstorm in the middle of winter. "I need you to hail the captain, son." The first mate started rubbing the tips of his fingers on the switch of a flashlight. He stood there staring at the detective with nothing more than a big stupid grin on his face. After romping through the inner bowels of the vessel all night, the first mate felt entitled to a more detailed explanation. He flickered the switch on and off with a nervous litany, like the inceptive gaze of an alcoholic staring down the end of a bar top. What happened? We've located the missing passengers. Chapter 7. Loose lips sink ships. Now, watch your step around this part of the vessel. We don't want the tour to get any more haunted than it already is. Mwahaha. The tour guide was laying it on pretty thick at this point in the tour. I imagine his job, while once exciting, had become rather mundane and reluctantly routine. Coming up with new puns for the same old storyline must be exhausting. Under this very bulkhead, we lost our last crew member to a freak accident. What? What happened? See this door here? He said while pounding on the metal frame of the door. The pounding reverberated throughout the room. It shuts automatically as a fail-safe mechanism. A fail-safe? Katharina asked curiously. In the event a fire breaks out in the engine room, these corridors lock down as tight as a drum. Lovely. Don't worry. The feature has been disabled for some time now. Like I said, this solid iron door comes down in the event of a fire, floor, or engine failure. And it comes down quite hard. As you can imagine, if you get into a fight with a 500-pound door, the door always wins. At least it was a quick death, Mike said while shimmering. Quite the contrary, actually. The door crushed the legs of the crewman and kept him alive for an hour or so. All accounts were that the hallooing screams of the crewmen languished for that entire hour and could be heard throughout the ship. Not all were so lucky. Mike stood there speechless with a big stupid grin on his face. The kind of grin you see people make after witnessing something truly jarring. I mean, what was I supposed to say at that point? I felt it best to just shut my mouth for a while. I had 2 ears and 1 mouth. Time to start acting that way. The fastest way to get shit off your boot is to step out of it as fast as you step into it. Kat pulled Mike aside and whispered, The bloody footprints are a little over the top, don't you think? Mike scrunched his eyebrows at Kat as she pointed to a fresh pool of blood. From their position, Mike was barely able to make out the blood. Yeah, that seems somewhat excessive. I mean, who does that? Tells gruesome tales of fellow employees and has the gall to set up a trail of fake blood. There's a time for decorum and a time for schadenfreude. Now was not the time for the latter. Excessive? The tour guide inquired. The tour guide had phenomenal hearing, or I had unknowingly lost all respect for my own volume. The trail of blood over there, Mike said and pointed. The tour guide turned his head towards the pool of blood. To our surprise, he was equally perplexed by the attraction. The tour guide murmured in an incoherent response. From his response, I gathered the tour guide had no idea why there was blood on his floor. I didn't rule out the possibility of this being some elaborate hoax, but it certainly merited further investigation. Oh, shit, Mike responded. What is it? Kat asked. Stay here, Mike said while pulling out his smartphone and turning on the flashlight. He shined the light and crept to the pool of blood. Mike squatted down and inspected the dampened pool of blood. The tour guide stood over Mike, peering over his shoulder, like a spotter sitting over a sniper. I take it this ain't part of the tour, Mike said while looking back at the guide for confirmation. The guide stood there with a gaping hole where his lips used to be. In a way, that was a confirmation of sorts. Mike went back to inspecting the blood for a source. All of a sudden, I felt a firm pat on my shoulder and jolted up. The guide broke my concentration, and just as I turned to confront him, he pointed at something lingering in the corner of the room. I looked over with keen observation. Is that what I think it is? Oh my God, the guide said while holding back vomit from his mouth. To my dismay, there was a body lying face down in a large pool of blood. "This definitely isn't part of the tour." "Mike, what is it?" Kat asked eagerly, waiting for some kind of explanation. The tour guide was too occupied to be useful in an emergency. He relegated himself to a stairwell where he frankly concentrated on his breathing. So I did what I did best. Control freak engaged. "People, we've got a crime scene on our hands here. Everyone watch your step and start to trace your steps backwards." The group disembarked from the boiler room like a bunch of clowns exiting a clown car. There wasn't much decorum, mostly distraught tourists fleeing for dear life. Mike walked over to the tour guide and propped him up against the wall. The way I figured it, he was no good to me passed out on the ground. I needed to literally and figuratively pick him up. "I need you to call 911. Can you do that?" I grabbed him by the lapel and stared daggers into his eyes. In an emergency, people tend to do one of three things. People tend to lead, people tend to follow, people tend to get out of the way. People were rather predictable in that regard. I needed to find out what kind of person he was, and fast. "Look at me. Can you do that for me?" "I can." The tour guide whipped out his cell phone like a gunslinger in a duel. His fingers wiggled and wavered as he dialed for help. The other guests uncontrollably shrieked and moaned as the seconds passed. As the tour guide explained the situation to the operator, Mike walked toward the gloomy group of guests. "Everyone needs to remain calm. This is a crime scene." "Yeah? Who are you?" one of the more passionate guests shouted. "Me? I'm Mike Allen. Now, like I was saying." "Mike Allen, you say that like I'm supposed to care. There's a dead body over there," one of the guests pointed out. "Trust me." "Trust you? Get the heck out of here. Why should we trust you?" "My grandfather was a world-famous detective." "Great. Where is he? Sure wish he was here right now." "Yeah, me too, but he isn't. Instead of him, you've got me. I'm here, right now. What do I know about crime scenes?" The peanut gallery continued to rumble with a lackluster appreciation of the situation, like the audience at a middle school rendition of Julius Caesar. In times of crisis, it was paramount to quell dissenters by forcing them to submit. Dissenters often cause more chaos in times of great uncertainty. In his best baritone, Mike doubled down by saying, "What I do know is that the first person who discovers the body often solves the case. What I do know is that a small detail will often make the biggest difference." Chapter 8. Detective Jenkins is on the case. "Do you mind?" Of course not. Not at all. "Excuse me, officer," Mike said while taking a big step to the side. "That's Detective. Detective Jenkins." The detective knelt down next to the limp corpse, like a catcher squatting down behind home plate. He looked around the room, like a retiree at a casino scoping out a slot machine. The detective was a heavy-set man with a bronze complexion. He wasn't fat, necessarily. The detective had a bulkier build. Given how broad his shoulders were, I'd peg him as a former star athlete, probably a running back. He probably even made it to state in his heyday. Odds are he entered the police academy straight out of high school. The years weighed heavily on the detective, like a third-generation coal miner 2 days from retirement. He moved throughout the crime scene slowly and intentionally. "You found the body?" "I did." "You on the job?" "On the job? Are you a cop? You found a body, determined it was a crime scene, and set up a perimeter." "Oh, no, sir. I've just watched too many episodes of Order and Law." Interesting," he said with a shrewd skepticism. The detective reached into his back pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He shook the phone to activate the LED flashlight. The detective scrounged around the room with no clear direction. There was blood splattered from floor to ceiling. The damp environment compromised the credibility of the crime scene and stymied the investigation. The body was soggy and mushy, like a damp 30-day-old dish sponge. The detective was meandering about like a hound dog sniffing out a bowl of kibble. "Do me a favor." "Sure thing." "Mr. Order-in-Law, why don't you try to tell me what happened?" "What happened?" "Yeah, what happened? How'd you find the body?" "Well, the tour guide led us down to this room, and boom, there was a body on the floor." "Just like that?" "Just like that." Interesting. Seems odd to me, being a simple detective, that this would be part of the tour," he said while turning his flashlight over to the ceiling. "I don't think it is." Interesting. So who called 911? "The tour guide did." "So the tour guide found the body?" "No, I found the body." Interesting. Have you been on the tour before?" "First and last, by the way things turned out." "So, a first-timer notices a dead body clothed in black off a beaten trail." Mike immediately noticed the mood in the room shift to an uneasy comfortability. "See what I'm getting at?" "You think I'm a suspect." "I think it's a profound coincidence that you found the body. What are the odds of someone finding the body in this specific place? From what I gather, you couldn't have seen the body or had a clear line of sight to it from the tour," he said while flashing his light back at Mike. "There was a trail of blood." Kat spontaneously interjected herself into the interrogation. The detective looked over to Kat for some additional context to her statement. His facial expressions gave a grave depiction of his inner turmoil. His buddies on the force probably loved inviting him over for poker night. His face was riddled with an obvious lack of deceit. "Who might you be, exactly?" From my experience, people tend to respond to extreme duress in one of three ways. People either freeze, fight, or flee. Kat's subconscious kicked into high gear, and she froze up tighter than a mosquito stuck in molasses. "I'm Kat Myers. I'm concierge for the ship. I started last week." How interesting." "What is?" "I'm just trying to figure out how you fit into this picture. You seem about as out of place as that corpse over there." "I was with Mike when he discovered the body," she said in an attempt to bolster his ailing alibi. Isn't that interesting?" "No, not particularly that interesting at all. I heard the ship was haunted, but wasn't expected to stumble onto a dead body." The detective shook his phone and placed it back into his side holster. He wore a black plastic phone holster on his waistband. I was never much of a fashionista, so I couldn't judge his choice of unique wardrobe accessories. "Well, Miss Myers, that's the thing about crime scenes. What might not seem interesting to the untrained observer might make the difference between solving the case and closing the case." "Are we free to go now, Detective?" "Well, that depends." Mike spontaneously scoffed at his repugnant response. "Depends on what?" Mike protested. "Your alibi." "My alibi?" "I'd have to be pretty freaking stupid to discard a body and then claim to be the person to find it. I was born at night, but not last night." "No, not your alibi. Hers." Mike turned toward his companion and pleaded in her defense. "Katharina was with me all night. She hasn't left my side for a minute." Interesting. Not a minute?" "Not a minute."
"Fair enough.
"Are we free to go?"
For now. Friendly word of advice. Don't skip town, and don't leave your suite."
"Words."
"Come again?" Those are words of advice. You said word. If you're going to accuse of murder, you don't have to murder the English language in the process. Like I said, don't skip town. Mike absconded Kat and headed back to the suite. He had tunnel vision the entire way back to the suite, like someone stuck in a familiar rush hour commute to work. In what seemed like a matter of seconds, Mike and Kat arrived back at the suite. Mike pulled the room key out of his breast pocket. As he reached down into his coat, he noticed a smudge of blood on the back of his hand. The blood had a hardened consistency to it, like a smear of tomato paste on a focaccia roll. Somewhere along the line, Mike had committed the cardinal sin of crime scene investigation. He contaminated the crime scene. Mike turned over his hand to conceal the blood stain from Kat and intentionally inserted the key into the key slot. "What happened to your hand?" she said with a compassionate concern in her voice. She gravitated towards me and clasped my hand. She sandwiched my hand between her palms, like a hipster embracing a warm cup of limited edition homemade tea. Apparently, my attempts to be sneaky had fallen flat on its face. I was about as good at concealment as a polar bear on a desert island. "Oh, that. It's nothing. I must have just brushed up against the wall or something. I'm fine, really." The light glimmered green on the door lock and made that distinctive hotel lock clicking sound. It never occurred to me, but where was this date going? Where did I want it to go? It wasn't often that I discovered a crime scene on a first date. So, what a night. Yeah, what a night. Would you like a drink? After all that happened tonight, I thought you'd never ask. I'm not really sure what this hotel minibar has to offer, but, I said while swinging the door open to the suite. To my surprise, a bottle of champagne was bathing in a freshly iced stainless steel champagne bucket. It's on the house. Uh-huh. That might have been my dinner buzz wearing off, but it seemed a little too auspicious. I did find it a little presumptuous that someone would order me champagne without asking. Either way, it was just the pick-me-up I needed. Why look a gift horse in the mouth? What's the matter? You don't like surprises? Surprises? No. Not in the least. Kat started laughing at what she thought was a joke. In reality, I was a bit of a control freak. The very idea of surprises went against my very nature. Frankly, I found them to be rather rude and presumptuous. I don't like surprises. I like odds. People are, by and large, very predictable. If you know someone long enough, you can often deduce how they plan on making decisions. You don't say, she asked while delicately positioning the bottle in between her luscious pale thighs. Kat grabbed a napkin from off the table and placed it firmly over the cork of the champagne bottle. She leaned back with the bottle pointed towards the ceiling and clamped firmly between her legs. In a sudden jerking motion, she snapped off the cork. Voila! Not a drop of champagne spilled onto the floor. Nice trick. You know me, I'm full of surprises. Kat swung around and snatched the 2 champagne flutes from the bedside table. The flutes flickered under the warm glow of the incandescent light bulbs. Kat balanced the flutes between her fingers and poured a healthy amount of champagne. In another life, I was a bartender. I can tell. As the bubbles subsided and the champagne leveled off, she handed over a heavenly glass to Mike Allen. Mike grasped the glass from his gentle companion. Mike propped up his glass and tilted it towards Kat. Cheers. Cheers. Kat pulled back her flute and asked, What are we toasting? What are we toasting? New adventures. We did have quite the adventure this evening. The evening has only just begun. Mike gulped and gazed into the deep blue pupils swimming around in the pearly white eyes of Katharina. Do you want to kiss me? Katharina started slowly blushing, like the burner on an electric stovetop beginning to heat up. Seemed she was rather startled by his question and replied curtly, No. Oh, it just looked like you had something on your mind. I had a 50-50 shot and I took it. Can't win them all, but I miss every shot I didn't take. Part of me was disappointed, but the night was still young. My mind. You could say that. Katharina extended her champagne glass out like a relay runner handing over a baton. The glasses made a distinctive clinking sound as they met. Nothing quite sounded similar to the tips of crystal glasses tapping together. Clink, clink. Chapter 9. This is the end, my friend. Kat! Psst! Wake up, Kat! Mike silently shouted to his beleaguered and incapacitated companion. Somehow, we both ended up in some sort of dank basement tied to what looks like a steam pipe. The pipe was clearly weathered and worn away from years of neglect. There was an article in the paper about the massive upkeep for the Queen. Turns out the newspaper was right for once. The outer part of the pipe was covered in a grotesque forest green grime and crude black sludge. One minute we were sharing a glass of champagne in my suite, and the next moment found us detained in what seemed to be an engine room of some kind. This definitely was not part of the tour. Clap, clap, clap. Olivia Marie stepped out from behind the shadows like an exhibitionist about to pull back a trench coat in front of an unexpecting jogger. Her once pristine white uniform was covered in soot and grime. I looked down at my pants and noticed the same crud all over my body. "Oh, great. You," Mike said sarcastically. I took it she wasn't here to help. My only hope was to wake Kat up in time, and then, to be honest, this was all starting to look rather bleak. Kat slowly rose up from her slumped position. She didn't bother to make eye contact with me. She focused her gaze on the ground, like a guilty child who got caught red-handed stealing a cookie from the cookie jar. "Ooh-wee! That champagne sure had a kick to it," she said while brushing off her knees. Kat slowly regained her composure and woozily wobbled to her feet. "I thought you'd never wake up. About time, kid," Olivia said. She spoke with a succinct familiarity in her speech. She spoke as frankly as a doctor delivering bad news to an unexpecting patient. "I think your boyfriend is finally starting to put the pieces together." I looked at Kat to get a read on the increasingly dire situation. Clearly, she managed to pull the wool over my eyes. She didn't so much as glance back at me. "It's nothing personal, Mike. It's just the family business," Olivia Marie said while golf-clapping like an evil villain in a retro spy movie. I couldn't help but retort her statement with a scoff and a snicker. The humidity was baking my forehead and rupturing what little decorum I had left. How could I have been so blind? "You have got to be kidding me. Killing people on the Queen Mary is your deranged version of family bonding time?" Olivia settled her footing on the moist floor of the boiler room and folded her arms across like an upset Karen about to explode on someone at a grocery store. "Some families like to take skiing trips. Some families like to skydive. Some families like to rollerblade. We kill people on the Queen Mary. What's so wrong with that?" "Nothing, really. I mean, especially when you put it so reasonably." Mike scoffed for a moment at the absurdity of it all. He was in a bind, and there was no clear exit strategy that didn't end in a body bag. Sweat started to drip down his forehead like a nervous poker player trying to avoid getting his bluff called. Who would have thought? Killed by a couple of freaking Karens. What are the odds? "Aren't you at least curious as to why?" Kat asked her former fling. Her eyes glistened with a gleeful, intense glare. "Is this the part where you explain your tragic origin story in painstaking detail? If I listen, will you let me go?" "No. We're still going to kill you, but thanks for not begging for your life. Most men do. Frankly, it's rather pathetic." "Ain't that the kettle calling the pot black? Well then, why bother telling the story at all? Just get it over with." "Why bother? You men are all the same. Skip the foreplay and go right to instant gratification.
No, not this time. Not on my watch.
Normally, I would happen to agree with you, but in this case, why bother?
I guess you could say it's a tradition.
Tradition, for the love of God. Can you at least make it quick then?
Well,
Olivia began to continue her diatribe, but found herself instantaneously interrupted by Mike Allen. Ketchup on a steak. I should have known you were a murderer. Who in the world puts ketchup on a perfectly good steak? Heck, the cow's already dead. Why kill it again?
Don't beat yourself up too much. You couldn't have known.
Let me guess. All those years ago, it was you all along. Bum, 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 Mike said while standing to his feet. His pride wouldn't get wrapped up in their shame. He wasn't much for grandstanding, but he sure knew how to ruin a good surprise. Olivia started noticeably fuming. Her face lit up brighter than a Christmas tree at the Griswold's house.
It was me, you betcha. All these many years, behind the scenes, in the shadows, one step in front of the police at every turn.
Mike turned to Kat and asked, "Was it all a lie?"
No, not all of it. Not really. Just most of it. You lovebirds done or what?
Sorry, be my guest, Mike said politely and sarcastically.
Ironically enough, it was your very grandfather that almost fouled up the whole thing for me back in '67. He nearly caught me in the act back then. Nearly mucked it all up. Private detectives can be rather annoying nuisances. Like all men, he was easily charmed.
Just as I was about to relieve myself all over my backside, a loud clicking sound interrupted Olivia once more. The kind of distinctive clicking that often accompanied a nickel-plated .45 single-action Colt revolver. Mike had become all too familiar with the cocking action of his grandfather's favorite firearm.
Seems like crazy runs in the family,
a voice echoed from the inner bowels of the ship. A foreboding, modest man leapt out of the shadows into the fray. Kat and Olivia Marie both looked at each other with utter confusion. Kat looked over to me for some kind of clarity. All I could do was return a warm smile. I shook my head and said, "Sorry, I wasn't exactly honest with you either."
You mean you're not an insurance actuary?
Well, okay. No, I was mostly honest with you. I'm an insurance nerd. That part was very true.
Oh, good. I don't date liars, she said.
About time you'd showed up. What took you so long? Mike shouted to his grandfather.
Seemed like you had everything under control. If you two lovebirds want to talk this out, I can always come back later,
Mike Sr. said while pulling back his trench coat and putting his cocked revolver downward at the floor. Shadow beamed into the dimly lit boiler room and draped over the threesome. The revolver glimmered and shined against the incandescent glare of the hallway lights. Can someone get me out of these chains? Don't get me wrong. Under different circumstances, I'd give it a shot, but all things considered, now is probably not the best time to explore my fantasies.
You're not going anywhere,
Olivia shouted with a sassy sanctimony. She swiftly pulled out a knife from her boot and placed it up to Mike's exposed throat. The jagged knife firmly planted under his jawbone. The knife was crudely sharpened and chipped from years of neglect. It was a relic from another era, much like Olivia. Oh, what's the matter with you? Put that thing away. Come on, you're going to hurt somebody, Mike pleaded persistently.
Put it down or what?
Olivia asked audaciously. Or, I'll leave a bad online review, that's what.
I had my theories back in '67. Theories that a crew member was killing passengers, but I never knew why or whom,
Mike Sr. said as he tucked his revolver into his waistband. He slowly stowed the revolver away like someone storing luggage under a bus. After a second or so, he began to raise his hands up above his head.
Why? Why? You couldn't begin to comprehend why. What's it been, 50 years or so? Humor me, darling.
Olivia scoffed at the former detective's ploy, but found solace in regurgitating her motives to her victims.
Try me,
Mike repeated his request with a degree of reticence. Olivia scoffed again and said, "Imagine your grandfather working for King George, working 16 grueling hours a day to build the greatest ship the world had ever seen. A ship built out of love. A ship built out of iron, sweat, and blood. A ship that stole everything from me. A ship that bankrupted my family. A ship that robbed me of my family honor. Why, you ask? Ha! The shipmaker worked my grandfather into an early grave, that's why. This boat stole something precious from me, and now I avenge my grandfather by... Blam! In an instant, Mike Sr. drew down his revolver on Olivia Marie. Without compunction, he slammed down on the trigger like a gunslinger at high noon. His aim was severely obstructed by humidity of the boiler room. Even for an old man, a shot from that distance wasn't much of a stretch. Adrenaline steadied his hand and held the barrel true. The sound echoed and reverberated throughout the metal room corridors of the ship. Olivia feebly fell to the floor. Her breath slowed and whimpers fleeted as she writhed in pain from the gunshot wound to her kneecap. Part of me thought she would never shut up. Part of me thought I wouldn't see tomorrow. Part of me wanted to get the hell off the Queen Mary. Phew, thought she would never shut up. Subtle, Graham. Really freaking subtle. Subtlety was never our strong suit, grandson, he said while holstering his revolver back into his pants. Kat was petrified by the unfolding of recent events. Her grandmother was sprawled out on the floor writhing in pain, and her plans were seemingly falling apart at the seams. Kat! She broke her trance and looked back at me with a deflated disposition as Grant began to unlatch my bondage. I placed my hand on her shoulder, looked deep into her eyes, and said, "We would have been great together. We could have made it. We could have been outstanding. A gentleman until the very end." A loud shriek rung out from over Mike's left shoulder. Olivia rose up like a zombie rising from the grave. She mustered every last ounce of strength and lunged at Mike with the serrated knife. To Mike's dismay, she proficiently plunged the putrid dagger into his right shoulder blade. Mike Sr. stumbled back down like a teenager falling off a skateboard after a failed kickflip. He fell to one knee and drew his revolver down on Olivia. His grandson managed to scream bloody murder while leaping out of the line of fire. Blam, 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 blam. Mike Sr. unloaded the remaining rounds of his revolver into the twiggy torso of Olivia Marie. She flung and swung as the bullets ripped into her bony body. The wall behind her was splattered with blood like a Jackson Pollock painting. Mike hated modern art, almost as much as his disdain for serial killers. Somewhere in the process of repainting the room, blood splatter managed to completely cover the clothes of Mike and Kat. I once had an argument with one of my roommates about whether or not we would want to get shot or stabbed. Assuming we had a choice, my preference was to get stabbed. For the life of me, I could never figure out why anyone would want to get shot. You know the kind of argument, the kind of 3-drink deep elevated conversation. As I pulled the steel knife from my shoulder blade, I have to say my opinion on the matter has somewhat changed. "Oh, why couldn't she have just shot me instead?" Mike said as blood gushed from his ghastly knife wound. Crimson blood oozed down his backside and dripped droplets off of his drenched shoes. "I mean, I could try waking her up and asking her to shoot you. Don't be such a strunzo. What's the matter with you?" Mike Sr. scolded his grandson while shaking his head in disbelief. He was dumbfounded by the lack of appreciation for what had just transpired. Mike slung his arm over the shoulder of his grandfather, and the two men hobbled away to fight another day. Epilogue. Type, 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 type. Mike trained his gaze on the flickering fingertips of the concierge as she was proficiently pounding away on her khaki-colored keyboard. Her nails were cracked and chipped from hundreds of thousands of keystrokes. The relentless repetition reeled in Mike's fleeting focus. Normally I would have brushed something like that off as some innocuous detail, but every keystroke resonated as a reticent reminder of Katharina. "How was your stay with us?" "How was my stay? How was my stay," she says. "Get a load of this. Mike said in a somewhat irritated tone of voice. It was clear she was trying to alleviate some of the tension. The concierge didn't immediately respond to Mike's sanctimonious show of smarminess. She was probably trying to put the words together, like a child stumbling through flashcards mid-speech at the Model United Nations. Type, type, type. I mean, aside from the knife wound, and one of your concierge trying to kill me, it wasn't too bad. A concierge stabbed you? Wow. Wow. Really? I tell you one of your staff members stabbed me, and all you can say is, wow? Type, 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 type. Abruptly and without warning, the typing stopped dead in its tracks, like a train slamming on its brakes and skidding to a stop. Well, what? Mike said while favoring his shoulder. Well, what did you say to the concierge? What did I say to her? What did I say to her? What's that supposed to mean? What I meant was, you must have really gotten her riled up for her to want to stab you. Typically, from my experience, people don't stab you for no reason. I'm sorry, you said what now? Mike asked with a gaping hole where his lips used to be. I mean, you must have done something to deserve getting stabbed, right? Like it takes a lot to stab somebody. It's not like shooting somebody. Stabbing is up close and personal. Anybody can go around and point a gun at somebody, but stabbing, that is something else. Mike Sr. was sitting down in the lobby uncontrollably laughing, like the first time you see someone have milk come out of their nose. He was tuned into the impending disaster brewing at the checkout conversation. Mike rolled up his newspaper and smacked the arm of the pleather captain's chair. The pleather was worn out like a car with an odometer passing 300,000 miles. He rose from the chair and placed the newspaper firmly under his armpit. He slowly walked over to the front desk to alleviate his unsuspecting grandson from a clearly flammable conversation. He took the newspaper from under his armpit and gently smacked the back of his grandson's head. Well, honey, he had the gall to go Dutch. No, you didn't. On a first date, nonetheless. How could you do that? Shame on you, young man. She freaking stabbed me, Mike protested persistently. Serves you right, cheapskate, she said stubbornly under her breath. Type, type, type. You're fine. It's just a flesh wound. Don't be such a sissy. I'd take a stabbing over a shooting any day. How bad can it be? Mike sighed and said, the shame almost hurts as bad as the knife wound. Type, type, type. Okay, she said while spinning around to the printer. We've got you checked out and I've billed the credit card we had on file for your incidentals. Incidentals? What incidentals? Yes, sir. We charged you for the expenses on the minibar. It's all itemized here for you in your bill. I didn't touch the minibar. Sir, according to our audit, the only thing left was an untouched bag of peanuts. First she tries to kill me, then she tries to rob me? Could be worse. Look at the bright side. Bright side? You gotta be kidding me. What bright side? What kind of possible silver lining could I get from this trip? Stop being so negative, the concierge said reflexively. Type, type, type. Click, click, click. Yeah, think of it this way. When you're my age one day, heaven help us when that day comes, you've got a great story to tell your grandson. He ain't lying, kid. Plus, you earned an invaluable lesson. Oh my God, get me out of here. The concierge looked at Mike with some reproach. She had her arms folded and her eyebrows slanted down. Mike knew better than to overstay his welcome and snatched the bill from the concierge. He ripped it from her grasp like an owl snatching up a field mouse. All right. I'll never go Dutch on the first date. The end.